Hi, this is an Alt Shift X live stream. Today we're going to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones books, in comparison to Dune. There's a lot of interesting similarities. This stream was Aziz's idea. I've got a special guest today, Aziz from History of Westeros. Thanks for coming on, Aziz.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, this kind of it's so much fun to talk about parallels. It's one of the things we do over on my channel, and this usually it's historical parallels to A Song of Ice and Fire, or parallels within A Song of Ice and Fire, within the history of itself. But today we've got more of a fantasy series, sci-fi series to another, and two big ones, and that's really cool because kind of discussion is very niche, but really fun for anyone who likes both series.
Yeah, it's funny because like Dune and Game of Thrones are both so famous and popular, but I think a lot of people don't immediately see the similarities between them because they are different in a lot of ways. Like Dune is the science fiction series and it's got this sort of dense philosophical tone to it, whereas, Game of Thrones is the medieval fantasy, and so there are these superficial differences to it. But I think the more you look, you see how both series play with the same tropes and the same archetypes in really interesting ways. So I'm excited to talk about all these similarities.
Yeah, it's going to be very like deconstructive and very meta, and we're going to have to constantly ask ourselves, is this a trope that they both use? Is this a influence that they've both tapped into, or is this genuinely something that George R. R. Martin borrowed or was influenced by directly from Frank Herbert? And occasionally that's going to be hard to determine, or it might be a case of both. And of course, we have to reckon for whether it's subconscious or conscious, and we will never be to know that, but it'll be fun regardless.
Yeah, it's tricky to know for sure, but fortunately, you've done your research. So our first example is one that we actually do know that George Martin did deliberately in terms of similarities between Ned Stark and Leto Atreides from Dune.
Yeah, we have a quote here that he did, or that rather, that comes from an interview that he did. And this is actually a translation because he did this interview. I think, was it Russian? Yeah, it was Russian. And they were trying to ask him about, of all things that very related to this, they were asking him about Tolstoy influences on A Song of Ice and Fire. And that's an important note here, given what George says, which is Lord Eddard Stark is a great example. I always understood that he was not going through the finale of the first volume. Here, the model for me was not Tolstoy, but rather the science fiction Frank Herbert and his Dune. Frank knew that the Duke of Summer would die within the first part, after which the reader's attention shifted to the fate of his son and daughter. It went, it seems to me, a little further than Herbert. Ned Stark held out much longer, and he is an important character, not a secondary one, so the reader sees the world, including his eyes, talking about the famous Martin POV point of view characters. The more impact the death has, of course. And so that's our first major comparison, as you can see from the thumbnail, perhaps. Duke Leto and Ned Stark. And the parallels here are just all over the place. There's a ton of them. And some of them are also related to plots related to him and not directly these two characters. So this in particular is a very rich part of our set of connections for sure.
Yeah, because they're both like held up as paragons of honor and morality, at the same time as being these like feudal lords who rule over big chunks of land, and they have this huge power and they have this huge responsibility, and they're presented as like a model of how to use power well. And they are a father figure. Ned is a beloved father to Jon and Arya and Sansa and Robb and all the Starks, and Leto is a beloved father of Paul and a beloved lover of their partner. Leto's Lady Jessica and Ned's Lady Catelyn have like a really wholesome, loving relationship. So they're sort of like the idealized father in both stories, I think.
Yeah, that's well said and gets to the point really well. They are that role within the story as well, which is part of this, which is certainly we could call a trope. The father figure that dies kind of early-ish, or I say ish because in Ned Stark's case, it's ish. He's still fairly early in the scheme of what would be, I guess, 7 or 8 books, but it doesn't feel that early when you're reading it for the first time. It's like, oh wow.
Yeah, it's definitely like,
or
like,
rather,
a, like
it does
a
feel
first
very early
act.
when you read
It's
it
like a
first.
first act death that then spurs on the heroes. Like the death of the father is like the inciting incident that feeds the conflict of like the main story.
Yeah, and I really like what you said too about how they're both seen as good examples of power and using power, and how that's a model that is hard to repeat, and especially when times become difficult and people are willing to get really dirty and underhanded, and that's when someone like Ned or Leto is a bit of fish out of water, which is part of both of their stories. Oh, it's almost literally true for the Duke because he's comes from a water planet, right? And he goes to a desert planet. So the fish out of water works particularly well for him. But then, Ned Stark he's obviously out of his depth when it comes to intrigue. That's a plot line that comes up early and maintains itself for a long time. It's like he's not that good at this. His intentions are very clearly good. You can see that much, but he's clearly getting fooled by people. He's not making a lot of progress, and then it just backfires on him. He ends up in prison. Yeah, like it's you can see the parallels there, especially when the way they are both brought into it. I love this part. They both knew it was bad. They both knew they were getting into danger. Like Ned has the moment where he's trying to decide whether he should even go at all, and he and Maester Luwin and Catelyn are debating it, and the show reverses the way the books do it. But either way, it ends up the same decision of yes, I'll go. And it's the same with Leto. Like one of the reasons, the logic is that, well, we can't really refuse. We have to go, or Robert won't trust us, or refusing is worse than going. So even if going is dangerous, and it's very similar for Leto. It's like, well, we have to accept this. Even though we know it's a trap, we have to walk into the trap and survive it. And despite the fact that we're gonna walking into a trap, we're gonna be able to, hopefully that'll be enough to survive it, and then we can come out ahead. But of course that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's striking how similar it is. Like Leto is forced by the Emperor to take control of Arrakis, and Ned is forced by the King to take control as Hand of the King. Like they both are chosen like that to take power, and they both do it kind of unwillingly. Leto is more willing than Ned is, I would say. And yeah, as you say, they both know that this political situation is dangerous, but they both go into it anyway, and they die for it. And they both are capable politicians, but like not devious enough. They both underestimate the willingness of their political enemies to destroy them.
Yeah, because neither of them are soft, right? But they are not cunning. Like they're both strong, authoritative, and willing to make tough decisions, but they are not cunning. They're not, and they don't see cunning as well.
Yeah, I would definitely say though that I think the Dune books show us a more sort of dark and conniving side to Leto that a lot of the adaptations don't capture. Like we cover this in like the Real Dune video on Alt Shift X, which talks about how the Atreides really do a lot of like sneaky, nasty, immoral stuff in terms of how they treat civilians and using propaganda and their whole like plan to exploit the Fremen. So like there is definitely like a darkness and a conniving nature to the Atreides, but I think there is also a bit of a parallel to that with the Starks in A Song of Ice and Fire as well, because A Song of Ice and Fire, like the Starks are presented as these great, heroic, good lords who everyone respects, and the Grand Order conspiracy, everyone wants the Starks to come back, but there's hints of darkness to the Starks. Like when you read the World of Ice and Fire world book, and like the history section with the Starks is just And then the brutal kings of winter subjugated the Marsh King and took his daughters. And then they subjugated the Barra King. And then they were brutal warlords who took over the north by conquering and killing and taking the daughters and forcibly marrying and like doing all these awful things. That is how the Starks took the north. So, and there's also stories like the Night's King, which is, this mythical figure who made a deal with the White Walkers, and Old Nan hints that the Night's King might have been a Stark. And if we want to get really tinfoil, I think it's a fun theory that the Starks might literally have the blood of White Walkers in them, and that might be this Lovecraftian secret. So I won't go on too much, but I think that A Song of Ice and Fire also has a sort of hidden darkness to their supposedly noble heroic family, which I suspect might come to the fore in later books.
I agree. I think those were really good examples, and there's maybe a few more. Like just the fact that Ned executes a White Walker. I mean, a White Walker. Ooh, that would be amazing. No, Ned executes a Night's Watchman in the very first chapter after the prologue. Right. That wasn't evil, but it was a mistake, I suppose. At least not to listen to him. Maybe he had no choice based on the laws, but it was definitely not a good guy thing, and an odd way to present a heroic figure.
Yeah.
To start off, especially given what we know about the Night's Watch and the fact that guy really did see a White Walker. I mean, damn, like that was rough. So, you forgive it because of the circumstance and the fact that Ned's ignorant of what that man really saw and the fact that he's acting insane. But Bran asks the question, like, well, he was afraid, and was he insane? And that obviously sets up a lot of the things you're talking about. And then fast forward to much later in the story when we learn that the North itself, the practice of worship of the old gods, which has been led by the Starks, included things like human sacrifice and first night and awful other traditions that are nowhere near the province of good guys. Yeah,
I totally agree. And also, like, there's a lot we don't know about Ned personally. Like we think we know a lot of what happened at the Tower of Joy and what happened at Starfall when Ned took the Sword Dawn back to Starfall and then Ashara Dane killed herself. Like, what really happened with Ashara? What really happened with Lyanna and Rhaegar in the Tower of Joy? Like, my point is that there could be bad things that Ned did that we don't yet know about. So there's definitely more room to sort of deepen and darken Ned's past. And yeah, like as we were talking about like the history stuff, there's another great parallel in that the Starks have ruled the North for supposedly some like 8,000 years or 6,000 years. And there's a similar number for how long the Atreides have supposedly ruled Caladan. Like, it's a ridiculously, unrealistically long time that these dynasties have survived. And I think the implication in both is that the way that you survive as a ruler for thousands of years is by being occasionally brutal. And your point is great about, we are introduced to Ned Stark chopping off a dude's head. And we see that through Bran's perspective, and Bran has mixed feelings about this. He's like, wow, I love my dad because he's so kind and loving, but also, wow, my dad is a lord who cuts off people's heads. Like, and I think that Dune and A Song of Ice and Fire are making the same point about power here, in how power, by its nature, sort of corrupts people and forces people to make these really tough choices that are sometimes dehumanizing and sometimes make us compromise our morals and sometimes force us to do bad things. So Dune and A Song of Ice and Fire are both definitely about power and how power affects people.
Yeah, no matter what you do, you're going to harm people when you're wielding power on that scale, and that's part of the lens through which you have to view these characters. And the ancestry is such a big part of it. You're right, that not only are their fathers a big deal, but the grandfather figure is a big deal for Duke, the old Duke, they call him, right, in Dune. That he's such an important figure, the way his bravery and all these examples he set, and how well he's remembered. Rickard Stark is a pretty important figure for how things are set up in A Song of Ice and Fire, you find out. And of course, his death at the hands of Aerys, and that's obviously really important. But the things he was doing before that, the Great Northern or Southern conspiracy, whatever parts of that you believe, some of it were certainly happening some degree. So that's pretty familiar as well, although those kind of intrigues are always going to be part of any sort of political story. High intrigue goes with royal families and dynasties and bloodlines, and that's a feature of the world building that's really similar, despite the fact that one is taking place in space and one is taking place in a very aggressively stubbornly low tech environment. It stayed that way so long. Now, which interestingly I think is something that Dune uses as well, and is one of my favorite, a slight diversion here, of things about Dune and how he wrote it to avoid the technology problem, was to build in the whole Butlerian jihad to explain why certain technologies which must have seemed inevitable in his time, which are kind of happening in our time now, are now he wrote in why those things aren't part of the world, and create a compelling reason for why thinking machines don't exist. And there's similar, not as direct, but undertones of reducing technology or keeping things in a dark age, or magic having comings and goings on a grand scale, in terms of how, like the comet, or how certain eras of A Song of Ice and Fire magic seems to work better. Age of Heroes versus like now, being times where it seems to work particularly well. Even if we don't know why. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and I think that's a part of the world building that, like you said, it's hard to notice that because it's fantasy versus sci-fi, even though one is Dune has a lot of fantasy elements to it, I would say, which is, that's not a pejorative by any means. I love fantasy. So
yeah. Both Westeros and the Dune Imperium seem to be like technologically stagnant. Or even going technologically backwards, and they both have in-world lore reasons for that. Like, Dune technology doesn't progress because they've got this Butlerian jihad banning computers, and A Song of Ice and Fire, Westeros' technology doesn't develop, possibly because of the long night, because the White Walkers keep turning up like the Reapers in Mass Effect and wiping people out. Like, it's not confirmed, but some people speculate that the White Walker long night might be a cycle that happens over and over. And and I mean that's very speculative. Another simpler explanation is the irregular seasons. Like, when you have a winter that is sometimes 2 years and sometimes 10 years, and that kills lots of people, that's going to set you back technologically. So like, there are in-universe reasons why Westeros' technology is kind of stagnant, and likewise with Dune.
Yeah, and what's cool about both of them, and this is something that isn't really a one borrowing from the other so much as a really fun trope that's used in both fantasy and sci-fi, is the idea of powerful objects from another time, or the powerful objects that are otherwise in a lower tech environment. Dune has some incredibly high tech things mixed in with, you can't barely use like something more than a calculator, right?
Yeah.
And like these incredible personal energy shields and other incredible technologies like the still suit, versus Fire, Ice, and Fire has comparisons like that, like Valyrian steel or glass candles. These are, of course, more explained by magic than technology, but they have the same effect on the story in terms of what it allows to be possible, and the way people seek after these items because of their value in that setting. And in some cases, they're extremely necessary. You must have them, or else. And that's there's even some more examples in that I'm sure I'm missing. What do you got?
Well, I think one of the central ones is in Dune, nuclear weapons or atomics are like this crucially important weapon that there are all these rules prohibiting the houses from using them, and that is like one of the key key forms of power in this world, and that's really similar to the dragons in A Song of Ice and Fire. Like George Martin has compared the dragons to nuclear weapons. And the dragons are also a power that is tightly controlled, and only the Targaryens want to have power over them, except for certain events in the Dance of the Dragons. So I think there's a big similarity there. Is it something else I wanted? Like you mentioned before, Rickard Stark, the father of Ned Stark, being similar to the old Duke, the father of Leto. I think like both of those characters are a great parallel in how they die, because the old Duke, father of Leto, Paul's grandfather, famously died when he was fighting a bull in the arena as a matador. So the old Duke put himself in danger and put himself in the path of this dangerous monster and died for it. And that's similar to, I guess that's more similar to Brandon Stark, Ned's brother, who went to King's Landing saying, "Oi, Rhaegar, come out and die." And Brandon went and faced the Mad King Aerys. And then what happened? Like, Aerys had Brandon captive, so Rickard came down.
Accepts the challenge. Yeah, he goes, because it's, he says, "I'll fight you."
Yeah, right.
Expecting to fight one of the King's Guard, right? And then he gets burned, of course.
Yeah, so Rickard, like the old Duke, went and faced the monstrous Aerys, and it was a fight that he thought he could win, but he died as a result of his, confidence in his attempt to win. So I guess that sort of frames like the political conflict of the next generation. Like the grandfather of the hero boldly fought and died, and so like the lesson to the grandson, to the hero, is, well, maybe I need to be smarter about this. Paul and the Stark kids, they both sort of know that overconfidence and directness got their fathers and grandfathers killed. So like you've got to be smarter and more political to survive.
Yeah, and then this brings up who the rivals are that are their main danger to survival in the first place, which parallels between Lannister and Harkonnen are pretty rich, including their vast wealth. Hey-oh, haha. You see what I did there? And they're absurdly wealthy, both of them, and for the same time scale as applied to the other houses in both settings. So Harkonnens have been rich for a crazy long time. And the Harkonnens as well. So, both of them.
Yeah, I like the idea, though, that like while the Starks and the Atreides are both these very, very ancient houses of this special ancient bloodline, the Lannisters and the Harkonnens are more new money. They are more recent powers, because the Lannisters, Casterly Rock is not their ancestral seat. The Lannisters stole Casterly Rock from the Casterlys, Lan the Clever, right? And then they started exploiting the gold mines. So they're new money who used economic activity and trade to get rich. The Harkonnens are the same, because the Harkonnens were cast down and exiled in the Battle of Corran, but then they recently regained power through, I think the quote is, adroit manipulation of the whale fur market, or whatever the phrase is.
Of course, that's a thing that you get rich from, because of course, we all knew that whales had fur.
Oh, I'm wearing my whale fur cloak right now. So I think it's really interesting that there's sort of this taint of there being something kind of immoral about getting rich from trade, as opposed to just being an ancient family like the Starks and the Atreides. The Lannisters and Harkonnens both made money recently. They are new money. They are the upstarts who are the rivals to the rightful old dynastic family, which I think is really cool.
And, we'll have to come back to one of these partial comparisons, because, of course, these aren't all one-to-one comparisons, but I think that in terms of actual characters, the best one-to-one comparison we have for a Harkonnen is coming later. So, teaser for later in the episode here. Yeah, that's a huge one, especially because another thing I like about that is just how the way it's set up in terms of what they're up against. You're up against, in terms of when you're reading Game of Thrones, and not necessarily later when the story expands and you've got a lot more characters and a lot more houses, But when you're focused on Stark and Lannister, you've got this exact same thing. You're walking into a character who's walking into their territory, what they think is their territory, meaning the Red Keep or Arrakis, something that they've had that they're maybe losing their grip on and want to get back. And one of the things about being the Hand is that for a lot of people, it's an opportunity to wield power, and wielded unscrupulously, you can make a lot of money at it. And that's kind of a similar thing here. It's not as direct as it is in Dune, where the spice is this just obscenely valuable, do everything substance that obviously control over that is going to mean a lot. Whereas even for someone like Leto, who's not going to exploit that as much as someone like the Harkonnens would to just an extraordinary degree. The same thing is going to be true for Ned Stark, where the main thing he's given is political power and legal power, executive power, and he uses that to almost pick a fight with the Lannisters anyway, because of the small scale capture of Tyrion and false blame placed on him for the murder of Bran, or the attempted murder of Bran. So that part is where things are a little different, because the Dune. Well, maybe you could say that's similar in Dune in a way. Because didn't the the Harkonnen Atreides feud start with some sort of military campaign snafu from long ago that was kind of minor, but resulted in a blood feud or something like that?
The Battle of Corran. Harkonnen was exiled for cowardice after allegations by an Atreides, and that's kind of all we know in the Frank books.
So that might be sort of similar, how a relatively small scale thing turns into a feud between two great houses. Which, by the way, something else I forgot to mention, George has lamented not using the title Duke in A Song of Ice and Fire, because Lord and High Lord are just too similar, and he wants a way to distinguish between the great houses, and just calling them Duke would have been a simple way to do that. So that would have been a really obvious parallel too if he had done that.
I think Tywin Lannister would have made a great Baron.
Yeah, just throw a few 100 pounds on him.
And yeah, as I think you noted, the Harkonnens and the Lannisters are the enemies of the hero are similar in that Princess Irulan Carino, the daughter of the villainous emperor, has blonde hair and green eyes, like how the Lannisters, Jaime and Cersei, have blonde hair and green eyes. So I don't know. I think that the commonality here is that the bad guys are rich and the bad guys are beautiful, whereas the good guys are these sort of noble, upright, ancient families who are not as wealthy as well. The books both make a point that the Atreides are not one of the super rich houses, and the Starks are one of the less rich great houses. So, yeah, strong parallels there.
They have the similar. This connects to the anecdote that I wasn't sure about that you clarified regarding the origin of their feud, which is that the Starks are very well regarded as a military force, or their soldiers are highly regarded, etc. And that was true for the Duke Atreides as well, just the Atreides family in general. And that's something that the Emperor, I suppose, and maybe the Harkonnens as well, are jealous of, is their reputation, because they're petty like that. And I think that was, to some extent, that's going to be true for some of the relationships within Song of Ice and Fire. Maybe some of them, Stark and Lannister, they're not as direct, I suppose, but they become that way as the feud develops early on. It's in Dune, I suppose, that feud has existed already for a long time.
Yeah, and there's definitely that idea in both stories that, the honorable Leto and the honorable Ned are destroyed early on by the conniving enemies, but the legacy of the heroic honorable Leto and Ned lives on. So like in Dune, there's the skull shrine of Leto that becomes this important lasting symbol of the Atreides, and Ned Stark's bones, like Leto's skull, Ned's bones become this plot point in the books where the bones are returning to Winterfell, and that's important. And the bones represent the legacy of these characters. They may have been defeated, but their ideals live on and continue to inspire people. And, you know, the whole Grand Northern Conspiracy plotline shows how the people of the North still want the Starks in Winterfell, similar to how, you know, Leto's legacy and the Atreides legacy is part of what Paul evokes. So they both last. And certainly, like, the protagonists compare themselves to their fathers. And there's always this question of, like, can I live up to my father's ideals while also not being defeated as my father was? So, yeah.
That's great, yeah. There's a lot of that in A Song of Ice and Fire, but sticking just to this family, it's pretty big because we're seeing, and obviously it's not played out fully, even though he's been dead for a while, the legacy of Tywin Lannister is pretty bad, right? There's just all these things are going wrong because of he made so many enemies. He was so ruthless and mistreated so many people, including his own family. That they're not living by his values. They're not living by the values. People aren't still remembering him the way they do Ned Stark. They're like, oh, now there's an opening. Now that he's dead. You know, it's a different sort of. It's opportunistic. Now that Tywin's gone, we have the Lannisters are weak, rather than, oh, Ned is gone, let's help save his daughter, right? That's a very big difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Although I you know, sorry, go on.
One quick one that I forgot to mention earlier that's a really neat quote is, "Feint within a feint within a feint" is a line from Dune. And wheels within wheels within wheels comes up a couple times in Ned's arc. So
yeah,
I love that. It's just, that's a pretty clear one. I don't think that one's intentional, but because it's so subtle, but maybe it is because it's so similar. But yeah, I guess we'll probably never know.
Yeah. Both stories are very sort of like self-consciously about intricate political plots. And yeah, using that same little pattern is a fun way to highlight that. Thanks for the super chats, by the way. Gunnar in a super chat points out that just as the Starks moved from a cold climate into a warmer climate, the Atreides moved from a cooler climate on Caladan to the hot climate on Arrakis, which is cool. And thanks also, Mora, who says, show of support. Thanks for all the great content. And thanks, Super Rad, who says Paul Atreides is Azor Ahai. We'll get to that. So
maybe a good segue point here is the way that their ending happens for both of them, which is when Ned Stark basically has no choice left. He's in prison, he's dying, and he is effectively willing to throw his life away until his daughter is threatened. Varys comes to him and gives him a chance to do that, help his family, make his death count for something. And for Varys, that's also advancing his goals. It's something that Ned will want to do. And on the other side, in Dune, we have Dr. Huey, who also is not necessarily isn't a loyal person or is a loyal person, not unlike Varys, but was nevertheless trusted with some important things, and is Huey's forced into what he's doing because of a threat to his own family. But nevertheless, he's doing a similar thing here, where he's helping someone else get revenge as part of their death, right? Helping, which is kind of part of that legacy thing we were talking about, as like a striking from beyond the grave kind of thing that they both have in common as they exit stage left.
Yeah. So like Varys convinces Ned to falsely confess to treason in order to protect his kids, protect Sansa, and Huey convinces Leto to use the poison tooth to try and kill Vladimir. So yeah, in their darkest hour, they both
to protect his wife too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so they both sort of die in a way that sort of besmirches their own honor. And they both are visited by a schemer who sort of gives them a chance to make their death mean something. So yeah, huge parallels there.
Cool.
So how about we move on to some of like the political background is really similar in both stories, because both worlds have this foundational political balance where there's the supreme king on the Iron Throne, or there's in Dune there's the emperor on the Lion Throne. The throne is called the Lion Throne in Dune. Iron Throne because of the
I
Rise of
love
Fire. Don't tell me that's a coincidence. Um,
it.
and one of the sort of fundamental plot points is that in Dune, Emperor Shaddam doesn't trust and is jealous of Leto Atreides' power, which is similar to how King Aerys Targaryen in the backstory of Game of Thrones was mistrustful and jealous of everybody. His son Prince Rhaegar and his hand Tywin, and that's part of what sparked the conflict of Robert's Rebellion.
Yeah, and in Dune we have Landsraad, which is basically an alliance of the great houses, which they're a check against the power of the emperor. If the emperor gets out of line, they'll all hang up, and together they're stronger than he is. And it's a way to prevent tyranny. It's a way to create some balance, and that's sort of what was lacking in Westeros. The Targaryens didn't have that check for a long time, but fast forward to the time of Aerys, and they lost that check because they don't have dragons anymore. But it had been some time since they had lost dragons, but no one had really challenged them except for challenges within their own family, if we count things like the Blackfires. But that's again a cadet branch of their own. So outside threats didn't really happen until something that was very recent within the time frame of the Song of Ice and Fire. Robert's Rebellion is mentioned constantly early on in Game of Thrones. It's a huge part of the framing for the story and the setting.
Sorry,
and
1 second, technical issue. 1 second, I'll be back in
Really?
1 second. Yeah, sorry. Can you all hear me? Are we back? Let me know in the live chat if we're all okay. I think we're back, Aziz. Sorry. Can you hear me, Aziz? All right.
We'll be right back, I suppose. I'll just keep filling in here while.
All right, we're all good, Aziz.
He makes his
Sorry
way
about
back.
that.
So, yeah, the Landsraad is basically the great houses, and what we see at the beginning of Robert's Rebellion is Aerys pushing too hard against the implied feudal vassal relationship, which is that, hey, I'm your king, but if something goes wrong and there's an outside threat, I'll organize everything and get everyone together and command and stop that threat. And in the meantime, you pay me taxes and bend the knee and all that. But if you just murder me out of hand without any fair justice behind that, well, that's not okay. And in Dune, there's a system against that. They've been around long enough to have fixed that sort of thing. That system doesn't exist in A Song of Ice and Fire, but it was what people like Rickard and Hoster Tully were trying to create. They were trying to create more of a check on the royal house. That's the basic idea of the Southron conspiracy, which is a series of marriages and alliances that would keep Aerys from doing too much.
Yeah.
Or the royal house going, thinking beyond Aerys once he's eventually gone. And Rhaegar was basically behind that. And of course, that's kind of what's too bad about the fact that it came to war and Robert killed Rhaegar, because Rhaegar would have probably been a reasonable one to work with. But as it turned out, Aerys ignited all that, and the story went the way it did. And that's very similar to what happens in Dune, except that it had happened. It's happening during the story instead of maybe 15 years prior. So obviously, there's going to be some differences here and there between these parallels and how they're used within the story. But that's pretty cool to see these parallels.
Yeah. Yeah, what's that line where
another one we have here is
what's that line where Rhaegar is
Targaryens
going
and Carinos? Both of them are corrupt ancient dynasties that have held supreme power for a long time, and that is obviously something they're losing for various reasons. In this case, the most direct parallel would be just being a bad, paranoid leader that can't handle oneself and is unable to maintain the sort of composure and lack of ego that goes into wielding this kind of supreme power.
Technical difficulties. We'll be back in 1 second. Hey, can you hear me, Aziz?
But he is nevertheless a bit soft, at least on someone sitting in such a important position.
Can you hear me, Aziz?
I sure can.
All right, we're good. We're back. Sorry about that.
No problem. I filled in a little of that while you were gone.
Yeah, we're all good. Yeah, I wanted to add with that idea of like the southern ambitions, great houses and Rhaegar all plotting to get together and to put checks to reduce Aerys's power, like that line that Rhaegar has before he goes into battle that Jaime remembers, where it's like a council will be called, changes will be made. That was Rhaegar's attempt to try and change things, and I think it's really similar to how Paul talks about the Landsraad. You know, I could bring evidence to the Landsraad that Emperor Shaddam tried to destroy the Atreides with Sardaukar, and when we sort of present that to the Landsraad Council, then we'll be able to reduce Shaddam's power. Like, that's a very, very similar idea that, and in both cases it doesn't work, it doesn't happen. The houses don't get together to stop Shaddam. It's Paul's doing and the Fremen's doing, and Rhaegar and the Southern Ambitions Alliance fails to put checks on Aerys. So there's a failure of like sort of political due process that causes the heroes to have to go and solve the problems instead.
Yeah, and almost a similar thing happens with Ned's arc as well, where he's trying to create or gather enough evidence to present to Robert, but it all becomes irrelevant because Robert just dies, and it's sketchy whether Robert would have done about it as well. So yeah, it's neat how this is almost a diversionary tactic than these storylines that both authors like to use rather than just engaging in more straightforward tropes. They sort of set it up one way and then kind of take a right turn, maybe a second right turn after that.
Yeah,
forks.
I think there's a sense in both stories that, like, you know, they both are these medieval-ish, feudal-ish political systems, and they both fail to stop their tyrannical leaders, King Aerys, Emperor Shaddam. Both feudal systems are failing, and so like there's a sense in both stories that we need to change this system. Like, we need to dramatically change this monarchical feudal system because it's creating injustice and it's creating horrors. And so a big part of what the Dune series is about is exploring different political systems and changing things to make a better universe. And I'm really curious about what A Song of Ice and Fire will do. Like, it's interesting that at the end of the Game of Thrones TV show, we have King Bran in charge of Westeros. And the show never really explores what that means, or like why is it a good thing for King Bran to be in charge? But I think that, you know, we anticipate that if it is that Bran becomes king in the yet to be published Game of Thrones books, I think it'll explore, like, you know, how King Bran will be a different political system and how it will be better to avoid the horrors of the past. But we can talk more about King Bran and Dune a bit later on. At the moment, we're doing like no spoilers or light spoilers for Dune in this live stream, but later on in the live stream, we will talk more about spoilers, and we'll warn you when we do talk about any big spoilers for Dune.
Yes, the God Emperor of Westeros is coming later.
That's right. Shall we talk about Jessica and Catelyn?
We should indeed, because they are another good set of related parallels, starting with just kind of some obvious physical features, like they're both redheads and they're the wife or concubine in Jessica's case, but it's very functionally very similar of this doomed father figure type. And Catelyn is a doomed mother figure. Jessica, not so much. It's not really the same in that sense. So that's a divergence, which is nice to see as well. And they're both someone that had to really adjust to a new living situation, right? They are not from the place that they have to settle and have children. Catelyn's not from the north. Jessica's not from Caladan, and that parallels within each other the stories that we just set up. Whereas Ned goes into a very unfamiliar situation to be Hand of the King, and Duke Leto goes into a very similar situation, going from Caladan to Arrakis, which is very unfamiliar, both in terms of everything. It's just really unfamiliar, geographically, politically, and all that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that while Ned Stark and Leto Atreides are sort of the idealized father, where like the children have nothing but love and respect for their father in both Dune and A Song of Ice and Fire. The mother, Catelyn and Jessica are not as idealized, and I think they have more complicated relationships with some of their children. I mean, Jon especially obviously has a really complicated relationship with Catelyn, who is not his mother and who rejects him. Even like Arya, I think, has a somewhat more difficult relationship with Catelyn. I mean, there are certain revelations about Jessica in Dune that complicate her relationship with Paul as well.
Yep.
but I think it's interesting that like it's definitely I think it's a more complicated and a more layered relationship with the mother as opposed to the father, Ned and Leto, who are idolized by their children.
Yeah, and that's true. It is more complicated, and I think the fact that there's also more children in the A Song of Ice and Fire setting complicates it as well, because they do have varying relationships. I mean, just checking you used Jon as an example. That's obviously a stark example because of the relationship with Catelyn. But then there's more straightforward examples like Robb, and then there's Arya, who arguably has a better relationship with Ned than with Catelyn, and Sansa, who is probably the reverse of that. Whereas Paul is obviously not the only child, but kind of effectively the only child in the first book, and that's a big deal and changes, especially in a power dynamic like they have with heirs and bloodlines and all that.
So something, a similarity is that both Jessica and Catelyn are very much motivated by wanting to protect their children, but at the same time wanting to advance their children politically. Jessica, more so than in the movies, Jessica in the books very much wants Paul to be restored to the leadership of House Atreides and to be politically powerful. And Catelyn, Catelyn in the books more than in the TV show, wants her children, wants Robb to be the Lord, to be restored to ruling their homeland. They're both politically ambitious, and like it very much explores how there's a tension between wanting to love and protect your children, but also wanting them to have political power, because of course having political power is dangerous. So, if you love your children, should you want them to be lords and kings? Because that's dangerous, and that's a tension that I think both of these stories explore.
Yeah, and that is the heart of one of the most direct, detailed parallels I think we might have between these two characters, which is the core plot for both of them very early on is Catelyn trying to figure out who killed Bran, and Jessica trying to figure out who killed Paul, or how Paul was almost killed.
Yeah.
There's a Chris knife and a dagger with a dragon bone hilt, which is of Valyrian steel. And these are both key parts of that. And you have a secret message from Margot Fenring, at least in the book version, with a secret code written that only in a way that only Jessica can understand because she's Bene Gesserit, and there's a warning about the Harkonnens. Meanwhile, Lysa, in a language that only Catelyn can understand, warns her about the Lannisters. Now, this is a false warning, but still, it's the same kind of thing where it's an early plot point where they get this message that steers their actions in a very direct and important way. And it's related to threats on not just them, but their children specifically, and
Yeah.
said advancement or lack thereof that you mentioned. So that, yeah, it's really, really huge similarity there. Even though those plots have huge differences as well, these similarities are like, oh yeah, I see that once you see them anyway.
Yeah, yeah, they both investigate the attempted murder of their son. They both have a special knife as a key piece of evidence. They both get a warning from a woman in a coded message. I, I mean, surely George had Dune in mind when he wrote this. And you note that Lysa's warning to Catelyn is a political ploy from Littlefinger trying to manipulate Catelyn because Littlefinger's trying to turn the Starks and the Lannisters against each other. But I think in a similar way we can question Margot Fenring's motivations when she sends that coded message to Jessica in the Dune book, because we know that the Fenrings are connected to the Emperor Shaddam, and we know that the Fenrings are working with the Bene Gesserit, and Jessica's goals are not entirely aligned with the Bene Gesserit. So I think that the complicated relationship between Catelyn and Lysa is similar to the complicated relationship between Jessica and the Bene Gesserit and Margot, for sure.
Okay, right on. Yeah, I guess I didn't catch that part, but now that you lay it out, I'm like, oh yeah, okay,
Yeah,
right
yeah.
on.
There's definitely like deeper, more complicated politics and like factional issues with Jessica than with Catelyn, but we've always got to remember that Catelyn is not born a Stark. Catelyn is a Tully, and Catelyn is connected to the Arryns through her sister, and so Catelyn has these political and cultural and religious differences from Ned and the Starks, which complicate her relationship with her partner.
Yeah, and they were both of their marriages were very directly related to the plotting
Yeah,
of prior generations. Catelyn's marriage to not just Ned, but it was originally going to be Brandon Stark, because that marriage was so important that they passed it down to the next son. And similarly, Jessica's marriage to Duke Leto was a lot of people had an interest in that, but particularly, I guess, the Bene Gesserit most of all, right? Would that be accurate to say?
yeah, yeah. I mean, that marriage of, well, not marriage, but that partnership of Jessica and Leto is part of the Bene Gesserit breeding program to try and create the Kwisatz Haderach. So it's really cool that both Jessica and Leto's relationship and Catelyn and Ned's relationship, they are both relationships that started for political reasons, but they both blossomed into true love, which is really lovely. Like that.
Yeah, it really is. That's kind of cool. And people say that these stories were grimdark, but and I guess these characters did have bad endings, but they got to have nice long lives of, at least partially. They got to have some time in the sun.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, sort of.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's important that like the hero protagonist characters get to see this model of like idealized true love in their parents before it is lost. So in the same way that the heroes like Paul and Jon Snow, that they ask themselves, can I be as honorable as my father? They also ask themselves, can I have a true love like Ned had with Catelyn and like Jessica had with Leto? Like it establishes those ideals of love and heroism for the protagonist to strive for and struggle for as the story goes on.
Yeah, something to keep continuously remember. And George likes to invert that, where we also have a character, Tyrion, and then Jaime and Cersei as well, who are showing us the opposite, showing us the mirror. That by they're constantly thinking about their father, and it's not a good thing. It's like, oh, it makes me feel bad, or it's well, my father would have done this, and it's something awful.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Just as Jaime, Cersei, and Tyrion grapple with their shitty father, Tywin's legacy, we see how Irulan has to grapple with her monstrous father, Shaddam's legacy. And, Fade has to deal with the Baron Vladimir's legacy. And there's sort of a tragedy that these people who are born into these, who are the children of villainous fathers, like, they don't necessarily want to follow in their villainous father's footsteps. Tyrion doesn't necessarily want to be like Tywin. Irulan doesn't necessarily want to be like Shaddam, but there is like this sense of inevitability about following in your parents' footsteps and just the political realities, So there's much about like legacy and family and bloodline and power that both of these stories explore.
And that's what kind of why I brought up Tyrion, because he's specifically the one that points out that we are the puppets that dance on the strings of those that came before us. Because that's
yeah.
a nice, succinct George way to say that. And maybe George got that line from Shakespeare or something, because that's another major influence of his, along with Dune.
Yeah, yeah. George has some great line about how his chief influences are William Shakespeare and Stan Lee Marvel Comics, which is wonderful.
Something in between there, yeah. I love it.
So our next parallel is the scheming and devious Peter de Vries, the Mentat assassin who serves the Harkonnens, is very similar to Littlefinger, Peter Baelish, the political schemer in the small council.
Yes, indeed. We have, first of all, a fun world-building aspect of Dune that is Mentat, and there is not a direct equivalent, really, in A Song of Ice and Fire, I suppose. But there is the example of someone who's just really good at math, and that alone puts them above everyone else, which is a similar role within the story, especially because these are very unscrupulous people. They're not fully in charge of their own destiny. They have to work for someone else. They're both small. Obviously, the name is similar. I'm sure you noticed that one already. One of them has the pointed chin. The other has a chin beard. Everybody knows they're not trustworthy, but they're so useful that they are allowed to stick around. Getting into some go ahead, yeah.
Well, there's something I find like something that recurs again. Like we talked about how the Harkonnens and the Lannisters are both villainous and they're both associated with money and wealth. And in a similar way, like Peter de Vries and Peter, like Littlefinger has this financial acumen. I mean, I guess Peter de Vries is not associated with money per se, but he's like a devious, smart, mathematically inclined person, and there's sort of the villainy of being a manipulative nerd, which is huge with both these characters.
And we have what their ambitions are, which is lusting after these two characters we just compared, Catelyn and Jessica, the redheads that had all these other things in common with each other. So that just by extension creates a lot more parallels.
Yeah,
that I particularly like
wants
is
Jessica.
The offer they receive.
The offer?
The offer of the cursed fief that requires enormous upkeep. When Peter is offered by the Baron, you can have Dune or you can have Jessica. And he puts him in that position, and then Peter actually claims Harrenhal to be worthy of Sansa. So it's a similar kind of need one to have the other, or you can have one or the other. And I thought that was cool.
Yeah. They both, like Peter and Littlefinger, are both the like nerdy, angry, bitter, spurned underdog who wants power and wants the hot redhead, and they both get tantalizingly close to having it, but they don't quite get there. Which is really cool.
Mm-hmm. I like that one a lot.
And both of them, I think, are parallels and contrasts to a more heroic mentor. So, Maester Luwin is the wise teacher of the Stark kids, and he's this really nice, well-intentioned guy, even if he's completely wrong about magic. And similarly, Thufir Hawat, the Mentat, is like the good guy version. I mean, he's not really a good guy, but he's like the more heroic version of Peter de Vries, who is the beloved mentor of Paul. So we get like a good wise man figure in Lewin and Thufir, and we get an evil, conniving, smart man in Peter and Peter.
That's pretty cool, and we even have a little bit of them working for the other side by force. Lewin had to work for Eon when they were taken over by the Ironborn. That's a pretty small part of his arc, but it is, that's how he goes out.
And, that's a great point. The heroic wise man, that they both get captured by the bad guys, and they both advise the bad guys. Lewin advises Theon honestly and wisely, and Thufir advises the Harkonnens in a slightly more complicated
that's what
way.
He does.
Yeah. And of course, we can note that Thufir is a much more nasty, evil dude than Lewin is, because Thufir is, after all, a Mentat assassin, and his job is murdering people. And there's some fun lines in the books about how the Harkonnens fear Thufir Hawat, because he's just this implacable enemy who just absolutely will gut the Harkonnens at every opportunity. So there's Dune is it does lean harder into the villainy of even the heroes, because of course Dune is about deconstructing the idea of heroism and questioning the idea of heroism. But I'm sure we'll discuss that more later.
Yeah, the better comparison for a lot of what Thufir can do is like Bloodraven,
Yeah.
He's the highly feared, questionable methods, like powers that maybe he shouldn't have, kind of thing.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the fun thing, is that like, Littlefinger thinks that he's the master manipulator, but then like a level above him, it's more like, oh no, Illyrio is the master manipulator. And then you're like, oh no, wait, Bloodraven is the master manipulator who's above them. And then, hell, maybe Quaithe is up there as well. So, there's levels to it. In a way that I don't think Dune quite... Oh, well, no, I mean, Dune does have sort of levels as the series goes on. I won't spoil it, but, after Paul, there are other gigabrain mega people who are, it's sort of... There's this power creep in Dune, where there's like a new super powerful person in each book practically. So, there's... the scale expands in both stories, I suppose.
There's more powers behind the powers, just like there is in Song of Ice and Fire. It is less historical with the song, as in the Song of Ice and Fire. A lot of it is just stuff that's revealed from long ago, whereas the stuff, it's just like there's more players involved as the situation shifts, etc.
And there is a sense in A Song of Ice and Fire that like the tide of magic is rising. Dragons are reborn, White Walkers are returning. This is an age for gods and heroes. I like the idea that Euron Greyjoy is emerging as like a new next level supernatural threat. So I guess both stories have this sort of power creep, this increase in stakes and scale that increases as the story goes on.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It starts off as a squabble in two houses and the royal house, overshadowing it all, and then expands to include a lot more houses and interests and supernatural / high tech aspects, and goes from there. Yeah, much.
Yeah, and I think that the scale and complexity increases so much that the respective authors lose control of their stories, because I won't spoil it, but Dune, the ending of Dune is almost explicitly a moment where the author kind of explicitly says, oops, my story has gotten out of my control. I've gone too far. There's all these crazy characters doing wacky things, and I'm not really sure what's going on, to be entirely honest. And like that is the end of Chapter House. And whereas A Song of Ice and Fire, George, I don't think has quite admitted it to himself yet, but I think the reason why the Song of Ice and Fire series is unfinished is largely because George has introduced too many characters and plot lines, and the scale has increased and the complexity has increased, and he's no longer quite in control of his own story. So I think that there's a very strong like meta similarity in how Frank and George both sort of lost control of their rapidly expanding universes.
I agree that, and especially maybe 20, 30 years from now, some of these parallels will seem even more stark or more direct, or maybe not. Maybe some of them will look less so, depending on how next 10, 15 years actually go. But yeah, it's so true, especially as well the arc of getting things made into TV shows and our own personal influences. I know we had a few notes on that in terms of just like things that they've done where Dune has a lot of parallels to the wars in the Middle East over oil or the drug wars, whereas The Song of Ice and Fire has allegories to climate change. And these aren't necessarily, oh yeah, I definitely did this. George has said that he didn't do that on purpose. He's also said it absolutely works for that. But it doesn't really even matter in terms of authorial intent if we're just talking about what's there and what isn't. And so they both have, you can see the products from their own time and things that were important during their era when they were writers and all that, which I think is always a fun thing to deconstruct and look at.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating that they both are of their time, and yet the stories are so similar despite coming from such different times. I mean, the Dune books were published first in the 60s, and Song of Ice and Fire was, some 30 years later in the 90s, and yet they are so similar. And I think that's because, like, I think that both Dune and A Song of Ice and Fire, that they are responding more to fantasy literature and like tropes more so than they are responding to like current events. Dune is very much about. I mean, they both draw from history as well. Frank Herbert enormously was influenced by, Sabers of Paradise and what's his bloody name? The story of the European guy who goes into the Middle East and takes control and leads the local people. And in the same way, Song of Ice and
Lawrence
Fire...
of Arabia.
Lawrence of Arabia, sorry, yeah. And, Song of Ice and Fire is very much about Wars of the Roses and stuff. So, like, I think they both draw more from history and from literature and from, tropes and common stories than they do from their current time necessarily. I mean, George R. R. Martin is writing The Winds of Winter in the year 2023, but The Winds of Winter is not about the year 2023. The Winds of Winter is more about the 80s when George Martin was coming up. And George has said as much in interviews that George is not writing about 2023 politics in A Song of Ice and Fire. He's more responding to history and more universal cultural ideas.
Yeah, and that's something that interests him more in general, the things that he reads about. Like, he grew up reading history, and he has painted figurines of knights, and he loves, Lord of the Rings is one of his biggest influences. And yeah, so that sort of thing, history repeating itself, the cycles of history and ancient world or the medieval world, that is more his jam. Even though he's, unlike a lot of authors, he has written substantial amounts of both. He has a pretty wide catalog. He's written a lot of sci-fi, and he did that before he wrote Song of Ice and Fire, which is probably where he gets some of that ability to use different notes within a familiar story, which helps be more unique. I think that adds to it overall, I'd say.
Yeah, I think both George and Frank are writing as much in response to Beowulf and the Iliad as they are to the politics of their contemporary time. They're really reaching for something more universal. And I think that's part of why these series have so much longevity. Like, Dune is a book that is being read and enjoyed some 60 years after its publication, and A Song of Ice and Fire, I suspect, will be read for a long time as well, because they're both reaching for something universal rather than chasing any kind of like current trend or whatever.
I wonder how much they have in common regarding doing psychedelic drugs. The question
Yeah,
must be asked.
yeah, drugs are definitely a theme in both stories and in both authors' lives.
Yeah, right. Like I know Herbert experimented with psychedelics, maybe more than experimented with. I'm not quite as clear on George, but he's a huge fan of the Grateful Dead. His Deadhead and that subculture. And yeah, I mean, he doesn't have children, so there's nothing really stopping him. So yeah, and with the Werewood visions and the way he writes things like that, yeah, it might pay off to have some experience if you're going to write prophecies and visions to maybe had a few of your own.
Yeah, yeah, because obviously spice is the powerful drug that's at the heart of Dune, and there's also other drugs like Sappho and Samuta in Dune. A Song of Ice and Fire, the drugs aren't as obvious, but you have drugs like the Shade of the Evening, which Daenerys takes before her visions, and Euron also drinks Shade of the Evening. And interestingly, Shade of the Evening stains your lips a dark blue, dark purple, dark indigo, which is similar to how the Mentats have their lips stained red by the drugs that they take. And the indigo
Yeah,
of Shade of the Evening might be a bit like the blue of the spice in Dune.
like that one. Yeah, and the whatever brand drinks, that thing that is debatedly Jojen paste or not seems to
Yeah.
trigger a bunch of visions as well. So there's that, as well as factors like dream wine apparently can maybe cause some visions. I know there's that famous scene where Jamie has his vision, his dream with Brienne underneath Casterly Rock and Kingsguard and all that, the ghosts in blue and white. He's under the influence of dream wine and fever, and he's got his head resting on a weirwood stump. So, you know, you've got multiple factors there too.
Yeah. Shall we talk about the Baron, and Illyrio Mopatis, the conniving fat man at the heart of the story, pulling strings?
Ooh, let's do it. This was the character I mentioned that has isn't a Lannister, isn't a Lannister within the story in terms of Illyrio, but has the characteristics of a Harkonnen, which earlier we made the Harkonnen Lannister parallels. Both of these large men have rings on every finger, and as I the favorite parallel here in terms of their way they move is that Illyrio is unusually light on his feet, and the in-world description for that or reason for that is that he's a former water dancer, whereas the Baron is also unusually light on his feet, and that's because of the suspensors. That's not unusual, I guess. It just would look unusual when you're seeing it for the first time. Now, if you watched all the various TV shows and movies, usually have him floating, but I think in the book it's more of a lot of help. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't recall exactly. Either way, it's very similar in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, as you say, yeah, I think in the Dune book, the Baron doesn't so much levitate and fly. He more is just held up partly by the suspensors to make him lighter. So it's almost like comical the way he's described as like this big fat baby who sort of drifts and hops across the ground lightly as though he's walking on the moon or something. And it's like the Villeneuve Dune movies make the Baron a lot more sort of serious and dark and a lot more dignified, whereas in the book the Baron is this more ridiculous, comical, over the top, talkative, also like a sort of like negative gay sex criminal stereotype thing. There's sort of this homophobic element in Dune in parts of it, but
Yeah.
but yeah, the Baron is more sort of ridiculous and over the top in the books, and yeah, definitely similar to Illyrio, because Illyrio, like similar to Vladimir in the books, the Baron in the books, they both love the sound of their own voice, and they both talk, and they both have these secrets that they blab about a little bit too much. The Baron, there's a couple of moments in the books where the Baron says something and gives away something, and then he's like, "Oh, why did I say that? I shouldn't have given that away." And in, I think, the same way, like in Illyrio's conversations with Tyrion, Illyrio says things about, "Oh, I have debts of affection to repay, and a dragon is still a dragon, and he has all these little lines where he sort of he can't help himself but sort of hint at his grand scheme, which I think is part of what leads or will lead to their undoing. So yeah,
the possible connection parallel to that is Arya overhearing Varys and Illyrio plotting under the Red Keep, and that's not them blabbing, because they have a very reasonable expectation that no one's listening, but it creates a similar thing where something gets leaked in a way that the audience can see kind of straightforwardly.
Yeah, I think it's.
They also have this.
Go
ahead.
I think it's interesting how both characters use words. Like the Baron Vladimir, explicitly, like Frank was obsessed with language and how language can be used and misused. And so there's times like, the Baron says, "Oh, I promised that I won't kill Jessica and Paul, so therefore I won't kill Jessica and Paul. I will just leave them in the desert, and the desert will kill Jessica and Paul." So it's a sort of like ridiculous, like semi-truth. And I feel like Illyrio plays with language in similar ways. I can't think of a direct example, but Illyrio and Varys definitely like play with like language and appearances. Varys is of course a mummer, he's a playwright. He takes on disguises and he uses things that are technically true but not quite. So I think there's similarities there as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's one example or two examples that come to mind from Illyrio is one where he twists Tyrion around regarding the poisonous mushrooms, and it kind of manipulates him that way and trying to tricks him into showing him, you do want to live. See, I proved it to you by presenting you with the choice. And another one maybe is the way he aikidos his way past Viserys's temper tantrums. Like when he's take me for a fool, and he's like, "Oh, I take you for a king," because kings lack the caution of common men. He just is very smooth at turning an insult into a compliment, and a lot of that is just the way Viserys took it in the first place. So, yeah, I agree. They're both very good talkers, and they talk a lot. And Tyrion thinks about that, how he just wants the more Illyrio talks and the more he drinks, he's maybe more careful than the Baron, but he does let a few things out that Tyrion's able to get a sense of a lot of things. Tyrion figures out that they're up to something. He figures out that young Griff is more important to him than he's letting on, which has led to all these Blackfire theories and him being his father, and more suspicions about his connection to Varys, and all these other things that help set up the Blackfire plot, the young Griff plot, whatever you want to call it. And that feels pretty similar here.
Yeah, well, you mentioned young Griff. I think that Illyrio has this conspicuous fondness for the handsome young boy, young Griff, which I think is similar to how the Baron Vladimir has a conspicuous fondness for the handsome young boy, Feyd-Rautha. And, Feyd-Rautha and young Griff are both talented, well, maybe not talented, but they're both like young, trained warriors, and they both have nice hair, and they both are moody teenagers. Like Feyd-Rautha and young Griff are both like these impetuous teenagers who have these sort of temper tantrums, and they sort of are learning to be smart. Like they are being trained by their villainous conspiratorial mentor. They're being trained to be a political player, but they are not as good of a political player. Like Feyd-Rautha is not as good at scheming as the Baron Vladimir. Young Griff is not as good at scheming as Illyrio, and that's how Tyrion is able to mess with young Griff and convince him to go west and all of that. So I don't think that Illyrio is like sexually interested in young Griff in the way that the Baron Vladimir is sexually interested in Feyd-Rautha, but I think there's definitely like a similarity to their close relationship and that sort of mentor relationship, and how young Griff and Feyd-Rautha, they both, I think, are unworthy scions. Like the Baron has invested all this time and energy into putting Feyd-Rautha into power, and Illyrio's put all this time and energy into putting young Griff into power. But we can plainly see that Feyd-Rautha and young Griff are both not worthy to be rulers, because
they're not as good as the alternatives. Yeah.
So
that's a super great point.
Yeah, they both explore like they both are manufactured heroes. Feyd-Rautha and young Griff. They both have been carefully created and groomed to take power, but that just isn't a good idea in either situation.
Ironically, they created the better alternative through their actions by sending them into situations where they weren't expected to survive. They weren't like modeled and protected all throughout their whole lives, even though they were given a great education. And Varys goes on with that speech to Kevin about how, oh, Aegon has been scared. He knows what it's like to fix nets and swim in a river and do all this like common born stuff. But that's nothing next to what Dany has gone through. Right? Dany's gone through way more than that. Dany's gone through legitimately feared for her life. She was sold as a slave. She was, taken by a Dothraki call and seen horrible things in war already at a young age, whereas young Griff didn't see any of that. And the same with Paul. Feyd didn't see any of those things. He didn't go through like true hardships. He may have had tough training sessions and sweated out, a lot of calories while in the gym. I'm sure his muscles were large, but he wasn't like shaped by the desert like Dany and Paul were, and fought with the Fremen or with the Dothraki, which are a bit of a parallel here, at least in this particular context, where it's just really hard living and it makes you tough if you survive it. And neither of them were expected to survive, and because they did, they're a better savior/leader figure than this engineered version that was basically grown in a lab. If you want to use that metaphor.
Yeah.
That's the plan that's being foisted here. You have a Baron who's his beast Raban to be a bad ruler that everybody hates. He's doing this on purpose in order to later replace him with his beloved engineered alternative in Feyd, which is exactly what Illyrio and Varys are trying to do by sending Viserys leading Dothraki to Westeros, and then have their guy come in and be the savior against that, and thus come out ahead and be beloved for his being such a hero. So it's super similar in that regard, of course. And obviously there's huge differences. If we were to sit here and list all the differences, there'd be huge differences as well. But these similarities are stark and crazy and cool. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is a similarity that is so specific that I think it almost has to be George copying Frank Herbert, because, yeah, Illyrio sending young Griff to replace awful Viserys is the same goddamn idea as the Baron sending Feyd to replace the awful Raban. It's the same plan, and it's such a specific plan. So yeah, I love it.
Love it, yeah.
So,
and of course, I wonder if I think Illyrio isn't rich from whale fur, but he does trade, and he did get rich from. I mean, that origin stuff is kind of similar, and he eats like crazy, and yeah.
Yeah, they both love food and money and luxury, and that sort of indulgence is all coding for a sort of villainous vibe. So yeah, huge similarities. They both are slavers. Illyrio has slaves, and the Harkonnens have slaves, and so they both use and abuse people, and that's part of their villainy. And yeah, like it's that whole idea of Illyrio creating and installing young Griff, and Vladimir installing Feyd-Rautha. It's that idea of you can't manufacture true worthy heroism. You can't be born into true worthy heroism. You can only get it by experience and work and intention and hardship, and that's what Paul and Daenerys represent. And that's how both stories criticize monarchy and feudalism. It's that idea that any kind of power passed down through generations is just a deeply flawed system. And so
even when the good guys wield it, right. Even they can't avoid a lot of the problems that come inherent to the system.
Yeah, you're not born into power. You have to earn power, and that's what the heroes do in both stories.
Yeah, that's part of Jon. We didn't even mention Jon Snow. That's a big part of him as well. Whether or not, no matter how his end goes, he has gone through a lot to gain power or to have been placed over other people to have the responsibility of leadership, he first went through legitimate dangers and survived legitimate things and suffered and a lot of that. So yeah, Arya, she's not necessarily going to be a leader, but she's gone through a lot. Sansa is probably going to be a leader, been through a lot, right? And yeah, it's a recurring. They're all going through legitimate experience rather than something that's cultured or done behind closed doors.
Someone in the live chat points out that the second Dune book has a quirky, funny dwarf called Bajaz, which is similar to Tyrion is often playing word games and being funny and provocative. I think there are some similarities between Bajaz and Tyrion. And
it's a great point. I'm surprised I missed that. It's really obvious now that you mention it. Yeah, that's a good one.
And George has had several dwarf characters. I remember the authors of The Expanse, Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank, were saying that George Martin, like the Expanse sci-fi story, started as a tabletop role-playing game with Daniel and George and others as players, and George's character in this role-playing game was a dwarf character with a really ridiculous name that I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, dwarves.
That's amazing. I knew about the campaign stuff. I didn't know George's character was a dwarf, though. That part's new to me. That's great.
yeah. George has a thing for dwarfs, apparently. Anyway, so shall we talk a little more about Daenerys and Paul, because they both are these, scions of ancient powerful houses who lose their birthright, and they both wander the desert, and they both learn to survive in a different environment, and they learn to live with the locals, the Dothraki and the Fremen. What other similarities are there?
Yeah, this is a really strong one, and it's nicely led into from this plotting of before, where we talked about who the real hero figures are, the ones who have really had strong and tough upbringings. That's probably the most overarching similarity between them, is that they are inheritors of huge, important bloodline at a really hugely important time, and they both have prophetic visions. They both have, like you said, they're going out into the desert and survive that. And out in the desert, they interact with and come to lead an extremely powerful local regional group like the Dothraki / the Fremen in this case, who are extremely formidable. Like the Fremen, of course, are a much, much, much older culture. They're much more highly developed. The Dothraki are more just straightforward warrior culture in its first few hundred years, or maybe a little later. It's kind of unclear when they actually started, but they definitely aren't anywhere near as old as the Fremen. And though the Dothraki don't tame dragons, Daenerys does, and that's obviously a parallel to the Shai-Hulud and the riding of sandworms, which very few people do, just like very few people ride dragons in the history of A Song of Ice and Fire. And they both have a family member with them when they go out into exile. Of course, Dany has an incompetent, poor influence on her in Viserys, whereas Paul has Jessica, who is extremely capable, like the exact opposite of Viserys' level of competence and level of education and mental fortitude and everything. I mean, they're about as opposite as it gets here.
Yeah.
Including the pregnancy part is similar too, because you have Paul Paul obviously isn't pregnant, but Jessica is, and then Dany is pregnant, and it's with someone who is passed recently within the story.
Yeah, it's interesting that like Daenerys, I think, has this intense loneliness because she's a Targaryen alone in the world, and as you say, Viserys is not a good family member. And Paul, in contrast, Paul has his mother by his side. He has a family member watching his back, which is great. But I guess Paul's isolation comes more from his prescience and his visions and all these experiences that are going on in his head, that's sort of what isolates Paul. And yeah, as you say, they both have these prophetic visions and this sense of destiny that drives them. And we can talk more about prescience later, but it's something that is both empowering and it's also dangerous. And there's also a question, like, you know, part of the books is that Paul, the way Paul treats the Fremen is exploitative, is sort of part of the point. And you know, we can question, is it right the way that Daenerys uses the Dothraki? And that's something that I guess we will see more of in the next books.
Yeah, and you're right, because that is obviously a huge question for Paul, and just not just how he leads the Fremen, but how he wields power in general, which will also be a question with Daenerys. And they both will have to battle Messiah complexes. Like Dany is having these thoughts about, you know, I'm lonely, I have all this power, I need to be responsible with this power, but it can be overwhelming. I mean, we've seen her once or twice already maybe lose her temper and do something that she probably shouldn't have done in terms of morality, her own morality. It would violate some, you know, things that she has said previously she wouldn't do or wouldn't want to do. And that's the thing we've been talking about since the beginning, the use of power. And this is where we're going to talk about Paul and Bran in a minute, and this is where those things diverge. Dany did not have good examples of wielding power well. She had Viserys, and when she thinks of her father, that's the Mad King. Like, that's not a good example, and it's a good thing that she wasn't raised by him. But her one maybe decent example is Rhaegar, who never actually was king, and she didn't know him. And yeah, and then she's Khal Drogo. Like, she falls in love with this guy kind of because, like, he's such a strong presence within her, the only strong presence within her world, the first person that like treated her halfway decently, even though he also, you know, married a 13-year-old or whatever she was, which is pretty sketchy. So that's what just goes to show what counts as good treatment in her world. Whereas Bran, when we talk about him, that's what's going to be more similar to Paul. Like, Paul had a pretty good upbringing. He had great education. He was treated well, and he had a lot of people helping him learn, which is more similar to Bran. But we'll hold off on that for the moment.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Like, Paul had every advantage and every luxury and all the training and knowledge in the world when he was growing up, whereas Daenerys had nothing. She basically grew up on the streets. So I think Daenerys had a lot of obstacles and hardships that Paul didn't. Paul has advantages over her. I think there's another similarity in that, you know, like Paul and the Fremen and like Daenerys and Slaver's Bay, they both are characters who come into these foreign lands and these foreign cultures, and they tell these foreign cultures what to do. Paul says, hey, Fremen, you should follow me against Shaddam, and you should fight in the Weirding way. And Daenerys comes to Slaver's Bay, and she's like, hey, you guys should stop slaving, and you guys should treat the people differently. And she tries to totally upend the social order of this foreign culture. And there's lots of, like, complicated ideas about whether or not that's a good idea. Both stories have been accused of being a white savior story. Like, I remember, was it the end of Game of Thrones season 3 when Daenerys liberates Astapor, or is it Marine? And there's that scene where all
the
of
crowd surfing scene. Yeah,
Daenerys surfs the crowds, and it's like this very like visually striking thing where all of these like darker skinned people are worshipping this white skinned person who has just come to save them. And so both stories have been accused of being a white savior story. And, you know, I think the point of Dune is that it's about how Paul is a false messiah, and it's about how it is a bad idea, and it is wrong how Paul exploits the Fremen. Whereas I think A Song of Ice and Fire has not quite... that storyline has not concluded. We don't really know how Daenerys will resolve the situation in Slaver's Bay. And I'm really curious how it will end. Like, will it end with, you know, Slaver's Bay is like, wow, thanks for fixing our culture, Daenerys. You sure told us a superior set of morals and cultural norms to follow. That's great. That's sort of what happens in the Game of Thrones TV show, where Daenerys inexplicably leaves Dario Bloody Naharis in charge of Slavers Bay.
Yeah, that's like,
And like
that guy?
we're sort of meant to believe that Slavers Bay is fixed now, and it's like, really?
Dario can take care of it. Don't you worry.
Yeah, and and again, like George says, he doesn't write allegory, but like there's obvious parallels to, Western invasions of the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq and some of those situations not turning out so well. So I'm really curious how the Daenerys and Slavers Bay storyline will resolve, and whether it will turn out to have been a good idea for Daenerys to try to take over and reform Slavers Bay.
Yeah, and that's something they definitely have that is related to this, is they both have both a legal, like they both been pushed aside from their claim or their rightful title. But they both also have a supernatural destiny. They're like a chosen one type figure. Paul's kind of an engineered birth by manipulation over a long period of time, trying to create the perfect conditions or whatever. And Dany, it's not quite that explicit, but she's the mother of dragons. She's the one that brought dragons back after all this time, and she had these visions in the first book of ancestors with pale swords and encouraging her to wake the dragon and all this stuff. So absolutely similar Child of Destiny stuff, and that's why this forks into Bran a bit, because he also has a lot of that, as well as Jon. So Paul is kind of Dany, Bran, and Jon wrapped into one, with maybe even some of the other characters, maybe even some Sansa thrown in there too. I don't know. It's hard to say, but there's a lot of these, because some of these things, as we said at the beginning, some of these are just common tropes or features of stories that have lots of politics and big power games, but some of them are pretty specific and pretty detailed. And it's kind of a challenge to suss these things out.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We were talking about how, like, young Griff and Feyd-Rautha are both, like, manufactured heroes and manufactured rulers, and how that's, like, not a good idea in the books. But it's true that, Paul is the product of this artificial breeding program, and he has been bred and trained to be a leader like young Griff. And Daenerys, she's the Targaryen heir, and she arguably may also have been the product of a breeding program, because it's not explicit in the books, but there are all these hints about how, many Targaryens were into prophecy, like Viserys in House of the Dragon. And there's all these hints that, the Woods Witch said that Jaehaerys and his wife should marry, and there's these hints about Bloodraven may have, like Egg marrying a Blackwood who have the old gods' northern blood, and that. It's a whole long speculative thing, but there are hints that the Targaryens may be following a certain prophesied bloodline genetic breeding program in order to, keep the dragon blood to themselves, and also potentially to produce the prince that was promised. That hasn't been revealed in the books, but I think that it is hinted at. And so, so in a way, Paul and Daenerys, they are both manufactured and artificially bred to be saviors and heroes. But the difference between them and young Griff and Feyd-Rautha is that Paul and Daenerys also have experience, and they also have struggle, and they also have hardship, on top of being bred to be heroes, and on top of being born into these great bloodlines. So they are a confluence of, like, all the different kinds of power coming together in one person, for good or for ill, because of course, Paul's ascension, I won't totally spoil it, but Paul's ascension turns out to be maybe not great, and Daenerys' ascension, at least in Game of Thrones season 8, turns out to be maybe not great. So there's huge parallels.
It's a mixed bag, because obviously she helped save the world from the White Walkers, but then that other part doesn't go so well.
Jackie C in the live chat asks if perhaps the direwolf human bond was also engineered. I don't know how much you like these tinfoil theories, Aziz, but I do like the idea that the Starks in some way deliberately acquired the magical power to skin change and to warg, because there's all these bits in the world book about how the Starks, the Starks took the daughters, and the Starks forcibly married the people who they conquered, including the Warg King. The Starks married the daughters of the Warg King, and perhaps it was marrying the family of the Warg King that gave the Starks the Warg blood and the Warg genes that allow them to have that power. And if George was reading Dune, and George has written other stories about genetic manipulation and modification, I don't know if it'll ever be acknowledged in the books, but I think it is very reasonable to think that the Starks deliberately acquired certain magical genes, just as the Targaryens have certain magical genes. I mean, Aziz, you and Ashaya interviewed George Martin recently, and George Martin was telling you guys about how, yes, like the reason why the Targaryens do incest is in order to keep that dragon riding gene to themselves, and it's part of a sort of eugenic genetic plan. So George definitely is aware of and is thinking in that way, and everyone should go and check out the History of Westeros George Martin interview if you haven't already.
Yeah. Thanks for the plug. Yeah, that was a really good interview. We got a lot of time with him, almost an hour and a half, and we've listened to enough interviews with him that we knew when to try to stop him, because he'll go off for 5 minutes on something that maybe he's said in other interviews. So we were trying to steer him in the direction of new things. And one of the things that came from that was him talking about how it wasn't just the Dragon Lords that did that. It was also the blood magicians of Valyria that did that, which makes sense. They're the ones that are fiddling with the genes in the first place to make them permanent, or to make them dragon bonded, or to make them something that's similar to skin changing, or whatever allows them to continuously have the same genetic features. Maybe some of that same magic exists in Westeros. We did some episodes on how the houses that still have weirwood trees seem to have stronger genetic patterns than ones that don't. So that might be, a way for George to have sort of implanted that within his world. So yeah, there's a lot of that in both, and this is one that's also not a trope, but a fun feature of fantasy and sci-fi. Maybe more fantasy, because in sci-fi it's more, well, you engineer this, you can change someone's DNA. That's more like in a sci-fi setting, it can be almost ad hoc. But in a fantasy setting, it has to be a little mysterious and more like underground, a little more random, a little more uncertain. And one that comes to mind is Lovecraft. His breeding of people with the old ones, or the deep ones rather, was a recurring feature in some of his stories, where people would have that within them and it would slowly manifest. And if madness slowly manifests in the Targaryens, and they already have, instead of fish features, they have dragon features, which we see manifested in some of these children that come out horribly wrong. So yeah, I think it's wrong. I think it would be wrong to not be open to some of these genetic manipulation theories without being too specific about them. Yeah, I mean, where did the Starks get that ability? Why did this horrible tradition of First Night persist? Well, maybe because they were trying to spread this magical DNA around to enough people. Or maybe that's why people accepted it, because they could receive magical DNA. And that also explains, the dragon seeds, who sometimes they considered themselves blessed when a dragon lord would come and sleep with them, because they might have a silver-haired child that, well, the implication being it's more than just the silver hair that matters there, So yeah, I think this is a big part of Dune as well. The manipulation of bloodlines, the certain families breeding with other families, the certain things being right at the right time. I'm not as familiar with the Dune stuff. I haven't read Dune nearly as many times as Song of Ice and Fire, but you filled that in all pretty well already anyway. So yeah, the parallels are very strong there. There's other stories that do this, like The Witcher, Bloodline, Chosen One. All these things come out in a lot of different stories, but I think both of these stories do it particularly well. They invert the trope. It's not just Chosen One, hero, win. It's, no, there's problems with being the Chosen One. Oh, what does this do to you? Lord of the Rings has that in a sense with Frodo isn't a supernatural being, but having held on to the One Ring for so long messes that dude up, right? And that's somewhat directly supernatural, but it's meant to also be metaphorical. Because it messed up everyone who held it.
Yeah. It all comes down to power, I think. Like the political power, the magical power, the prophetic, destined power. It's all different ways of looking at how does power affect people, and how does, you know, the act of striving to get what you want, how does that change you, and what is the cost? I think that's a big part of it.
Right on.
So while we're talking about, you know, Daenerys with the Dothraki and Paul with the Fremen, there's a lot of similarities, I think, with Jon Snow's relationship with the Wildlings and Daenerys' relationship with the Fremen. Because the Fremen are the free people who are outside the control of the realm, and the Wildlings call themselves the Free Folk. They are outside the control of Westeros, and they both are underestimated by the powers that be. There's some really similar passages where the Baron Vladimir and the Emperor, they think that there's barely any Fremen, just like a few renegades at the edge of the desert, whereas in reality there's millions of Fremen all through the planet. And similarly, there's a moment in Book 3 where Tywin says, no, there can't be lots of wildlings. Like, the lands beyond the wall cannot support vast numbers of wildlings. when in reality, you know, 100,000 wildlings turn up at the wall later on, and so they're both of these underestimated cultures who exist in these extreme climates and have adapted to these extreme environments, and turn out to be a force far greater than anyone expected.
Yeah, that is a kind of a speaks to how George writes his story, and one of the major comparisons of it to a lot of other stories, whether it's Dune or otherwise. He takes these things and he layers them. Like, Paul had all these things wrapped into one character, whereas we just talked about how a lot of these features are spread out between Bran, Jon, and Dany. In some cases, they're doubled. Like you just said, the Fremen are paralleled in both the Dothraki and in the Free Folk. And there's elements to them in both, and how they learn to lead, the lessons they learn as compared to the lessons of their home culture, and how they have to square those two is really important. Like, everything Paul has grown up with, a lot of it's thrown out the door when he meets the Fremen. But on the other hand, some of those things line up pretty well, and he's able to win them over using some of those things. But also, he just has, you know, the setup for him, you know, they are quoting scripture that you know, shows his arrival is coming, and they're like, oh, this is the person we've expected. So, which is, that I guess speaks to the vast amount of groundwork laid for Paul before he took the reins, before he was even born, but also before he took the reins of power. And for Dany, those things were there too. They just weren't laid out for her. They were laid out, but she took them. They were a part of her family, but she was an afterthought in Illyrio's plan until she wasn't. Until she proved she was. They were like, "Oops, actually, she did what now? She hatched dragon eggs. Okay, let's work her into the plan." You know, but she wasn't part of it initially, and that's kind of what Jon is. Jon was an afterthought to a lot of the main characters. He's not important. He's this kid on the wall, right? He was the bastard son that was the least important of the Starks. Obviously, as a reader, you don't necessarily see it that way, but within the lens of his society, he's sent to the wall when he's 15. I mean, that's clearly a child you don't expect to have a big future, but obviously that's not how it goes at all. He has a huge future, and that's the similarity between Bran and or Paul and Dany, except that Jon wasn't expected to die, though he was believed dead in the context of being lost beyond the wall. So, and of course, there's a couple times that happens, actually. But Jon's believed dead a couple times, and now currently we're waiting on him being stabbed and whether he's going to get back up. So, yes.
Yeah.
That one keeps coming.
Yeah, it's I mean, we were talking about how, you know, Paul and Daenerys are both sort of manufactured heroes, and they come from like a plan. Like, you know, Illyrio and Varys were planning to use Daenerys in their play for the throne, and the Bene Gesserit were planning to use Paul with the breeding program. But both of them, they benefit from that plan, but they go off the plan and they defy the schemers who wanted to manipulate them. And I guess this is sort of mild spoilers for the first Dune book, but, you know, Paul Paul defies the Bene Gesserit, and he goes against their wishes and their expectations. And I think in a similar way, Daenerys defies the expectations of Varys and Illyrio with the dragons and her plans for Westeros. So it's about defying the schemers and defying the plan and choosing your own path, for better or worse. And that's, with the Fremen and the Free Folk and the Dothraki, like, these are both these great armies that the heroes adopt control over, and they use these armies potentially to take over the realm. And in all these cases, there's an implication that it might not be such a good idea to do so, because, without spoiling too much, the Fremen's influence on the universe is maybe not good. And, John in his chapters thinks a lot about how, I want to let the wildlings through the wall, but if I do that, there will be thousands of wildling raiders who might want to raid the north and burn the north and steal stuff and kill people. And similarly, the Dothraki, Daenerys worries that the Dothraki could cause chaos in Westeros. So, the Fremen and the wildlings and the Dothraki are all these powerful tools, but who may cause as much damage as good. So there's a lot of danger and complexity there. I also like how, each of these cultures has a strong male leader who is respectable in certain ways, but who the hero screws over. So, like, the leader of the Fremen in Dune is Stilgar, and Stilgar is this really impressive, smart, thoughtful, capable, powerful guy. And I guess mild spoilers, but, Stilgar he becomes less, and he is reduced through his relationship with Paul. He becomes a follower, and he becomes less of, like, his own man as a result of Paul. And there's a tragedy to that. And I think in a similar way, like, Jon sort of supplants Mance Rayder. Mance Rayder, Jon likes Mance Rayder, and Mance is almost like a father figure to Jon, almost like how Stilgar is a little bit of a father figure to Paul. And yet Jon inadvertently causes Mance Rayder's downfall. He is still alive in the books, but, Mance Rayder is much humbled by Jon. And I think the other parallel is Drogo. Khal Drogo is the leader of the Dothraki, and I think Drogo is less admirable than Mance and Stilgar. But there is still a kind of tragedy in that Drogo, is beloved, at least by Daenerys, and yet Daenerys' actions cause Drogo's downfall. Daenerys tries to save Drogo from, that infected wound, but, Miri Maz-Dur, her influence may possibly have caused Drogo's death, or at least, Daenerys's involvement in, Drogo being turned into a catatonic zombie, and, it's Daenerys who puts the pillow on Drogo's head. So in all of these cases, the hero causes the downfall of a at least semi-likable leader, and there's something messed up about all of those.
Yeah, even if they're not likable, like you say, they're not like a good person. Like Drogo is not a good person, but you still find yourself curious what he's gonna do. You wanted to see him actually invade. Well, like a lot of us wanted to see what happened if he invaded Westeros, and like, how is that gonna go? Like, these aren't real people, I'm not wishing real suffering on the world. I want to see what happens if this dude invades Westeros. I remember a good friend of mine was like reading the books and was like, I can't wait to see what Khal Drogo does when he gets to Westeros. And I'm like, this was like 10 years ago. But so funny stuff like that. But yeah, you're right. Like, that's a similar thing. Like, it goes to the same power theme that we keep coming back to. George talks about it in terms of magic using a metaphor that I like, which is sorcery is like a sword without a hilt. And these warlike peoples that you lead to victory against an important opponent, only to have, what do you do with them afterwards, is that same kind of thing. The Dothraki are a sword without a hilt. The Fremen are a sword without a hilt once they have a certain amount of power or reach or whatever. Then they're you can't put that sword back in the scabbard afterwards. And that's a definite strong power theme between these two stories.
There's an interesting line in Melisandre's POV chapter where she thinks that she's sort of pretending to be helping the wildlings and Mance Rayder, but internally Melisandre thinks, yeah, these wildlings are doomed. The free folk are doomed.
Yeah.
Mance Rayder is doomed. They will go extinct. There's no helping them. And it's like this really dark, like messed up thing that, you know, Melisandre and the characters are using the free folk, but Melisandre expects they're doomed. And, you know, moderate, I suppose, spoilers for book 4 of Dune, but, you know, the Fremen, we learn, are also a doomed people, because ultimately their culture does basically go extinct and they become this pathetic museum Fremen culture, and, you know, they lose their original lifestyle. And you know, I think that is inevitable for the wildlings in A Song of Ice and Fire, because, you know, the wildlings have mostly already been killed by the White Walkers, I think, and, you know, like, and they've broken against the wall and they're having to leave their homeland. And, you know, even if the wildlings survive, I'm not sure the wildlings will survive beyond the wall, which I think, if they're not existing and living in their natural environment, in the place that their culture is based on, can their culture survive? You know, so I see a lot of similarities there with the wildlings and the Fremen.
It's a great one because it's also succinctly said by another character in the same parallel we're making, which is with Mirri Maz Duur. She mocks Dany when Dany's like, "Hey, I saved your life," and she's like, "Not really. You literally saved my life, but everyone I knew and loved in my home, all those things are gone. Like, what is my life sucks now. I don't even really want to be alive. Like, I kind of would rather be dead. I wish I died with everybody else. You know, I have nothing now."
Yeah.
And that's a similar thing, you know, with these, like, if the wildlings aren't free, if they're not living the way they lived, then yeah, they might still be alive, but they're no longer wildlings. It's not as harsh as Mirri Maz Duur. More a gradual thing, right? It'd be something that plays out over generations, like you say it does with the Fremen. But it's the same fate for those people. It's a way of life that dies with the events of the story, or starts to die. That you see that boulder start to roll downhill, even if it takes a while to get to the bottom.
Yeah, that's a great point about Mirri Maz Duur, because, yeah, we were wondering earlier if, you know, A Song of Ice and Fire ever will sort of, you know, question more Daenerys's savior role with Slaves Bay and everything. Yeah, I guess even from book 1, the Song of Ice and Fire books have said, hey, Daenerys, like, when you try and come in and save these other cultures, sometimes it's not as simple as you think, and sometimes you're not being as helpful as you think you are. And yeah, Mirri Maz Duur is a really, really strong point in that direction, for sure.
Yeah, they make it clear, and I think Dune does this as well, by showing you have, well, when it's an obvious, brutal enemy, your choices are simpler, but it can still lead to harm later. Like, with Dany, it's going to be very straightforward. Like, yeah, well, Dothraki are bad, but they're not as bad as the others, killing everyone, literally wiping them all out. And so that's part of the conundrum. But you also have this ground of, well, you can't just leave those people behind either. Like the Dothraki, those are, you know, it's wrong to wipe them out entirely. And with Slavers Bay, the example is, okay, well, George made it the worst possible people you could. Just show that even if you're trying to reform a culture that absolutely, definitely is evil. Like, there's no doubt Slavers Bay, like, he goes so far as to have them have hairstyles of horns.
Yeah.
Right? They shape their hair into horns. Like, it's hell. Like, it's meant to remind you of Western Christian versions of hell. There's people living in an extreme heat with constant, endless brutality, and the people inflicting this are ultra rich people with horns. You know, like, it's the metaphors are really strong. So you have like that to, if you can't fix that, if the moral question isn't whether you should fix that, it's how do you fix that. Right?
Yeah.
And if you can't even fix that, then how do you handle these much more nuanced situations? How do you, like, yes, it's right, the emperor is trying to kill your family, it's fair for you to stop him. But let's look at you're also affecting the entire galaxy or the entire known human galaxy.
Yeah, I think you're right that like George makes the cultures of Slavers Bay cartoonishly evil so that we can ask, if Daenerys can't reform these cartoonishly evil slavers who literally eat puppies without creating without creating like a moral quagmire, then how on earth can Daenerys hope to take over Westeros without creating a similar mess of moral complications? So yeah, I think that's what he's going for.
It's maybe getting a little too deep into just Dany specifically, but like, look who her advisors are. She's gonna have like Makoro and Tyrion and Jorah, maybe if he's allowed back. These are not like
the Tattered Prince,
not upstanding people. The Tattered Prince, yeah, like these are her people giving her advice, like Brown Ben Plum, like she knows these aren't good people necessarily, but still, this is who's telling her things, Kirsten is a good man, but he's not like savvy enough to give her advice on these trickier issues anyway, and he might not be around much longer.
Yeah, compared to Paul, who has like the most over the top, like virtuous, wise people, the best of the best are his advisors, and Daenerys' advisors are the worst of the worst.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dichotomy there that George lays out early on with the type of education that the different people are getting and their environment, their nature versus nurture versus, well, just those two. Yeah, I was going to add a third, but that's enough.
So part of the horror of Slavers Bay is, of course, the Unsullied, who are these children who are forced to kill puppies and who are castrated and made into eunuchs and used as slave soldiers, and we think there are some similarities between the Unsullied and the Sardaukar, huh?
Yeah, I'd say so, because they're both trained from a very young age, if not birth, and they're born into an environment that there's absolutely no escape from, and that you must turn into this thing that they're making you become. It's a lot like, well, it's definitely slavery in the Unsullied's case, even accepting maybe after Dany's freed them. And with the Sardaukar, they're basically a slave army, right? Like, it's not quite that simple.
I don't think they've got a retirement plan, no.
And they're pretty incredibly tough. Like, they're really hard to beat. They're perhaps the toughest thing there is in their world. Although, the Sardaukar obviously tested by the Fremen. That's an ongoing thing. And the Unsullied, we'll have to see what happens with them. How they stand up to memories of the dead or whatever else they face. I'm not quite sure about that yet, but it seems like that'll be... Even though they're not necessarily murderous, raping savages or whatever you want to call what's going to be left behind, something still has to be done with them. They still have to have lives after the fact. And they may be, rather than a danger to society might be a danger to them, because everyone's going to, they might be shunned, they might not be accepted, I don't know. It's, Westeros isn't going to be a kind place to them, even if they're heroic, even if their actions are important. I don't know that they'll be treated well. It might be like another opportunity for allegory after the fact. The veterans not being treated well, by the population that was benefited from their service.
Grey Worm will simply start his own noble house, Aziz, just like in Game of Thrones. Easy solution. I think that the Unsullied themselves are not necessarily cruel warriors in the way that the Sardaukar are, but the creation of the Unsullied is unbelievably cruel. And I think that cruelty is meant to reflect on the society that creates them. Like, the cruelty of the Sardaukar shows how bad and unjust the Carino Empire is, and the cruelty of the Unsullied creation shows how cruel and unjust Astapor and Slavers Bay is. So in both cases, it sort of justifies those regimes being overthrown, I think. I also think there's similarities between the Sardaukar and the Kingsguard, because the Sardaukar are like the imperial loyalist best warriors who serve the emperor, and the Kingsguard are the supposedly the best warriors who are most loyal to the Kingsguard. But of course, we learn that Kingsguard are sometimes not loyal, and they are corrupt, and they're sometimes not even very good warriors, like Boros Blond. And similarly, the Sardaukar, we are told, have become weaker because they're corrupt and they're arrogant and they're no longer as powerful as they used to be. So the Kingsguard and the Sardaukar both represent like the degradation and the corruption of their regimes.
Yeah, that's a great point. You see the Kingsguard, the early one, and it's something that's spoken of in the books in several places by several characters and how great the Kingsguard used to be. Even in Aerys' time, and it's debatable whether those guys were actually great morally, but they were definitely great warriors. And yeah, like in the current times, yeah, these guys are a mixture of horrible people and just incompetent people, and and people who don't belong, like Jaime. So even though he doesn't belong for a couple of reasons, possibly, but either way, yeah, the parallel is very strong, even though the Kingsguard is a much smaller order. And the Night's Watch isn't maybe as corrupt, but it is another example of something that an institution that fell apart over time, and that's causing big problems in this story. I mean, they're assassinating their own leader. That's not what you're supposed to do.
It's not a great
Kingsguard
look.
did that too. Yeah, both the Kingsguard and the Night's Watch have killed their own leader in the in the story,
Yeah. The rot in the institutions represents the rot in the regime.
Yeah, and you see these things within some of these other organizations, and that's a recurring theme with someone like Ned, who leaves a legacy of people wanting to be like him because he did good things, and that's a positive inspiration, versus the prior example of someone like Tywin, who inspired the opposite. And then we have the same with like a Baron Harkonnen, who he's worried about his own family killing him, right?
Yeah.
And Tywin's own family does kill him, so
Yeah, great point. Yeah, it's not only like institutional corruption, it's families are dysfunctional. Like the Carino family is so messed up and dysfunctional, and the Lannister family is so messed up and dysfunctional, and so are the Targaryens. I mean, even the Starks. I mean, all of the families are dysfunctional in their own little ways. Even the Atreides, like the sort of tension with Leto and Jessica's resentment that Leto never married Jessica. Like, I mean, it's like what is it that quote about how happy families are all the same, but unhappy families are all unique and interesting. There are no perfect happy families in Westeros, or if there are, George Martin isn't writing about them.
Yeah, they're not very fun. Let's leave them alone. I always think that's what's happening on the Arbor, like, except for now that Euron ships are hitting there. I'm like, where is the best place to be? Like deep inland at the Arbor, the Ironborn can't get to. Just have wine and it's warm. Winter's definitely not going to get down there,
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know where that would be in Dune either.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe House Toland or something is having a perfectly happy, idyllic life while all the messed up families are off fighting for power. I'd like to respond to some super chats, and then I'd like to move on to a slightly more spoilery zone as we start to talk more about some of the later endgame book type stuff. So thank you for the super chat from Isaac, who says, what do you think are the themes that Dune and A Song of Ice and Fire both explore the most, and how does it compare? I mean, we've talked a lot about power, haven't we? They both obviously are stories about power, and they're stories about heroism and questioning heroism and how power changes people. It's also about like prescience and plans and prophecies and the dangers of those things, and we're going to talk about those things in depth soon. Thanks for the super chat from Glidus's bastard son, Glidus Pike, who says, do you think that Dune Part 2 will be any good? What do you reckon, Aziz?
I think so. I mean, Part one was pretty darn solid. I mean, I enjoyed it a lot, and I think there's no reason not to think part two will be pretty good, at least, if not better than pretty good. So I'm pretty optimistic. Yeah, and I'm not usually that optimistic these days. There's so many. If it was the first movie, I wouldn't have been so sure. But now that they've done a good job with the first movie, I have more confidence in the second one. So yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I noticed that at least from the trailers, it looks like Dune Part 2 will be different from the books, much more than Dune Part 1 was. Dune Part 1 was pretty faithful to the books, it just cut out a few things, whereas Dune Part 2 seems to be introducing whole new plot lines that weren't in the books at all, involving like Irulan and Shaddam and stuff.
Riskier,
So,
huh?
yeah, it's riskier. Like, those things could be improvements, but I hope that they don't, mess with the heart of what makes the books good. I think that Denis Villeneuve's intentions are good, and I think that he wants to capture what the books are about. So fingers crossed.
Indeed.
Thanks for the super chat from Film Cram, who says, "Are you suggesting that, like the Kwisatz Haderach prophecy, or like the Missionaria Productiva, the Azor Ahai prophecy has been implanted in its variations across the world artificially to prep for the White Walkers attacking?" Well, there is that thing in House of the Dragon, which apparently George Martin suggested, about how Aegon the Conqueror may have had a vision and conquered Westeros in order to protect Westeros from the White Walkers and avert the apocalypse. And there's the implication that, Viserys believed in that prophecy and passed that prophecy down, and, Bloodraven's manipulations. And I think we can... There certainly is evidence in the books that the Targaryens were consciously preparing for the White Walkers to appear, and what is a prophecy if not a warning? What is a prophecy if not someone from the past saying, "Hey, this is going to be a problem. You should prepare for it."
Yeah, that's certainly a big theory around Quaithe as well, whether she's part of some manipulation. And manipulation doesn't have to mean negative, like they have some goal of profit or ambition. It can mean we need to manipulate this person into saving the world, or into putting her on the right path to doing what needs to be done. It's not about personal benefit. It's about making sure everyone survives, or making sure this threat is met properly and without any interference. So, yeah, I think there's definitely room. I mean, it's outright said that you can go into someone's dreams with glass candles. George already made it possible in his world in at least one way. So, yeah, dream manipulation or implanting a prophecy, which these are different things, but they're related. They're there. Yeah, the Azor Ahai prophecy is super old. The Prince That Was Promised prophecy is perhaps a different variant, or just a different name for the same thing, and that's been around a long time, and it's come up in multiple places. You got characters talking about it in a lot of, like Aemon talking about it. It relates to Rhaegar, it relates to Bloodraven. Yeah, we're just not there yet with all of the reveals, but it feels like it's going to involve some of those same mechanisms of manipulating the truth, but maybe for good reasons, and or just reading what's coming. The prophet. It could be more straightforward than we think in some ways. It's just the way George is kind of revealing it more slowly. But either way, you have this kind of this parallel. It works either way.
Yeah, it's interesting that in both Dune and A Song of Ice and Fire, like, prophecies are not things that just exist naturally and automatically and immutably, and they just are what they are, and they just are the truth. Prophecies in A Song of Ice and Fire are made by people who have motivations, and, we see how Melisandre interprets and misinterprets her prophecies based on her own biases, and we see how, like, visions and dreams are not just something that happened naturally, but can be planted, as you say, like Quaithe with glass candles enters Daenerys' mind and gives her certain messages for her own reasons, and Bloodraven enters the minds of certain characters like Jojen and Bran in order to manipulate them. And so prophecies are not just this inherent magical thing, that they are just another form of power and of manipulation. So I don't think A Song of Ice and Fire goes as far as Frank Herbert did with the Missionaria Protectiva, wherein entire, like, religions are created artificially over thousands of years deliberately by the Bene Gesserit. But it's not unreasonable to speculate because, yeah, it is suspicious that all over the world of Ice and Fire there are all these suspiciously similar prophecies about the prince that was promised and Azor Ahai and Herkun the hero and the last hero and you have to wonder, are these like natural memories of the past, or are they planted myths and planted messages with the purpose of telling people how to defeat the White Walkers when they come again, how to create Lightbringer, how to sacrifice an Izanissa, how to create Dragonsteel, or whatever the secret is. Yeah.
One we haven't even mentioned yet. We mentioned how Dany will bring Unsullied and Dothraki. She's also going to bring lore worshippers. They've been told that she's savior of mankind. Nero, the high priest of Red Temple in Volantis, the largest one, is openly preaching that when we see Tyrion and Jorah pass by. So that's a big part of the religious aspect that we haven't really seen fully play out yet, where we are seeing the Seven and the High Sparrow and that stuff just get started in the books, and we maybe have some idea of where that's going to go based on the show. But the show didn't bring in these hordes of Relorists. They just had one. They just had Melisandre, and Thoros was there too, I guess, but he wasn't really a zealot. So that's going to be, I think that's something that goes under the radar because it wasn't in the show. But I think we're going to see that is something else Daenerys is going to bring, which will help perhaps defeat the others, but also perhaps create some conflict out. Like, what are they going to do with all these like zealous fire worshippers in a realm of seven worshippers? And that's similar to some things that happen in Dune with belief and the people getting a little too into Paul and who he is, and that message going too far, and things that you were alluding to earlier.
Let's not forget fan favorite character Kinvara, who had such a huge impact on the story.
Kinvara.
Yeah, Daenerys is suddenly playing with fire, very, very literally, with the R'hlloric priests and Volantis and all of that, and again, I think that's similar to like the religious fervor of the Fremen behind Paul. We see religion as a dangerous, powerful force that can get stuff done, but it also is hard to control, and fire burns. Thanks for the super chat from Chug, who says that Jon Snow will be God Emperor of Westeros. Thank you, Lucifer. Lucifer Morganster, who says thank you, big fan. Thank you, Nizar, who says something weird about George Martin. Thank you, Sean, who says, thanks, Alt, you got me into reading Dune. I'm onto Heretics now, and they've easily been the best books I've ever read. What's your favorite movie? Wow. Yeah, well, Heretics is fun. A lot of people don't like Heretics and Chapter House as much as the earlier books, but I think they've all got a lot of fun, unique stuff going on. What is my favorite movie? Oh my god. Aziz, can you go first? I need to think what my favorite movie is.
Well, I'm going to take an easy way out and just say the one I've seen the most, which is Monty Python and the Meaning of Life. So,
fantastic choice.
I've seen that an absurd amount of times when I was younger. I had it like, when I'm old enough to have had a VCR and only a few tapes, and that was one of the few I had. So I would play my online computer role-playing games while just putting that movie on repeat. So I'll go with that, yeah.
Fantastic. I've got to say, I've seen the Blues Brothers a lot of times.
Ooh, good one.
That's a good film. I also really like the Royal Tenenbaums. I think I have a very basic movie taste. Like, I'm a real basic bitch when it comes to movies, so I'm a fan of Wes Anderson for sure.
I can't believe you said the Royal Tenenbaums, because that is the first movie Ashea and I watched together.
Oh, really? Fantastic.
Yep. About
yeah.
that.
No, I love that film. Thanks for the super chat from Jordan, who says Dune character alignment chart. Yeah, I saw that Notorious Rapscallion Alt-Swift X did some character alignment streams with Glidus, ranking characters on how chaotic or orderly and good and evil they are, the Dungeons and Dragons alignment system, which is fun. It would be interesting to do that with Dune characters, because Dune characters' morality is so fraught and complicated. It would be very hard to rank them, wouldn't it?
Yes. Yeah. How I don't. Jeez. What would Paul even be? What would at least rank him? Is he?
Yeah, Paul exists.
True neutral.
Paul exists on every point on the morality spectrum simultaneously. He is, and don't even get us started on like God Emperor Later the Second. My goodness, because he enforces order for the sake of chaos and evil for the sake of good. Oy, oy, oy. Thanks for the super chat from Film Comics Explained, who says, "The mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience," which is one of the great Dune quotes. And he says, "Thanks for providing the best detailed analysis on YouTube for both Dune and Game of Thrones that has helped us all understand our experiences with our favorite IP. Cheers, Niat." Thank you so much, Niat. And check out Niat's channel, Film Comics Explained. Thank you, Moss, who says, "Thank you for helping me stay connected to my friend who passed away last year. He loved your videos. Keep up the great work." Thank you, Moss. Sorry to hear about your friend. Thanks for the super chat from Zachary, who says, "Any news on the Jon Snow video, the Dune iceberg, more a cock? Love all your work. Your takes are witty and illuminating." I am making a Jon Snow video for Alt-Shift-X. It will probably be the biggest Alt-Shift-X video ever. I think it will be somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours long. It's a detailed examination of Jon Snow's story, how it differs to the TV show, where it might go in future books. I'm really excited about it. The video is mostly done. It will still take some time to complete, but I'm really excited about it. And I think it will be the next Alt-Shift-X video that comes out. So yeah, that is coming. And thank you for the super chat from Nuisance, who says, "I think there's parallels between Melisandre and Jessica as pseudo-prophets who are in on the facade. I like the position facilitating a fervent movement that puts them in resulting isolation." Yeah, what do you think of that, Aziz?
That's pretty clever, yeah, because Melisandre obviously knows she's making some things up and she's using, changing some details to push things in a direction that she thinks is correct. And yeah, and Jessica also we see her get in trouble with the Bene Gesserit because she does some things her own way and is already kind of a bit of a rogue. Melisandre's connection to the Red Temple and who sent her doesn't seem clear, which kind of leads us to believe, and I think reasonably so, that she's also a bit of a rogue and doing some things outside of what the higher ups or hierarchy, the people that wield power within the Red Temple would have done it. So yeah, that's a really good catch. I like that.
Yeah, I think there's a Suspect Martin where George did allegedly confirm that Melisandre is she went to Stannis and Dragonstone on her own accord, and she's not operating under the orders of a Red Temple. She's sort of a renegade Red Priest, which is really similar to how Jessica is like a renegade Bene Gesserit who is deviating from their plan. And yeah, in that scene with Mapes where Jessica sort of lies and manipulates to fit the prophecy of the Lisan al-Gaib with Mapes, that is really similar to a lot of what Melisandre does. When we see Melisandre describes towers by the sea crumbling under a great wave or whatever, and Jon Snow is like, "Oh, is that Eastwatch?" And Melisandre is like, "Oh yeah, that definitely is Eastwatch." But inside her thoughts we see Melisandre going, "Oh, I have no idea if that's Eastwatch. I don't think that actually was Eastwatch, but yeah, Jon seems to think so I'll go with it." So and that's really similar to when Jessica is like, "Oh, the Maker, yeah, I totally knew that the Maker is a sandworm. Yeah, I know what a crysknife is." So both Melisandre and Jessica totally bluff in a hilarious way. They cold read almost Mapes and Jon respectively. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. Nuisance. Thanks for the super chat from Isaac, who says, "Rewatched your Hooded Man video recently. Who's your favorite character in the North at the end of Dance?" I think that Wyman Manderley is enormously fun because Wyman is funny and evil and sort of heroic all at the same time. Wyman has the speech about the North remembers and how he wants to avenge his son who was killed at the Red Wedding, and he gets revenge on the Freys by cooking Freys into pie and feeding them to their family, and he sort of wants to help restore the Starks, and he wants to save Rickon, but really he's doing it for his own political empowerment, and he wants to take over the Hornwood lands, and like Wyman has so many layers and motivations, and is so much fun, and is so witty and fun to read, and so yeah, he's one of my faves. What about you, Aziz?
That does make some sense, especially if you paired with what you said before about how the real Baron is in the books, like how he's a little more almost goofy, jokey, and talkative, and Wyman Manderley is just very talkative, and he likes to he's gotten in trouble a little bit with things he's said even, so yep, I like it. I can see that for sure.
Thanks for the super chat from Galitus, who says, can you make a video about how Curious George is different in the books versus the TV show? Yeah, look, I mean, it's hard to adapt.
I thought you did that already.
I have been thinking of an April Fool's joke explaining Bionicle's lore. I think it would be really funny to go real deep into all of that, if anyone remembers what Bionicles are. But yeah, there's no limit to the ridiculous topics we can cover on an April Fool's video.
I honestly, seriously though, I not stand for the slander against the Curious George show, which is a faithful adaptation of the books. Actually, I have not seen the show.
If have you done any like straight up joke videos on History of Westeros?
We did once. We did the Wit and Wisdom of Stannis Baratheon a long time ago, and it was just like reading his quotes and just like setting up some of the funny things he said and just showing how funny he is. We cited him as, I think, the third funniest character in A Song of Ice and Fire. There's Tyrion and Dolorous Ed, I think, are probably ahead of him, but Stannis makes a strong case. He's damn funny. All his sarcasm and jokes about Robert and all that, yeah.
Yeah, Stannis was robbed by the Game of Thrones TV show. He has so many funny lines in the books that were just not included in the show, which is tragic.
Yes. A real tragedy.
Thanks for the super chat from Dylan, who says, "Do the Bionicle video," unironically. Yeah. Well, look, I guess we have to do it now.
Yep.
All right. I think we will now move into a slightly more spoilery zone, which means we will talk about like the ending of Dune Book 1. And we'll also move into some stuff that happens in Dune Book 4. Personally, I don't think people should worry all that much about Dune spoilers, because like the Dune books spoil themselves with the little quotes at the start of each chapter, and it's about prescience. But yeah, like if you're super worried about Dune spoilers, we will talk about some Dune spoilers from now on. Who should we cover first, Aziz? Do you want to talk about Bran or Jon or Arya and Aaliyah? What are you feeling?
Yeah, let's wrap up some of those ones, because those are kind of continuations of things we had already started talking about. I think one of the interesting things about Jon is he's sort of an accidental example of what Paul is engineered to be, whereas he's a combination of bloodlines. Whereas Jon just kind of accidentally ended up as a child of ice and fire. It wasn't necessarily the result of years of breeding, but it was, Rhaegar had a plan. He wanted to have the 3 children, and he thought he was following in some prophesied thing, but it's not clear exactly what he was doing. He certainly said his is the Song of Ice and Fire, from Dany's vision. We see that, and that is apparently being said to his firstborn son, the one that's killed, but then who he's wrong about. So this stuff is a little more murky in A Song of Ice and Fire, but the things are all there. All these like people trying to have a child of certain bloodlines, combining certain bloodlines, and it being for reasons laid out long before. And there's some of that with Bran too, except that he's maybe a better example of something that just happened. Even though you pointed to some examples of the Starks capturing magical bloodlines in the past, and maybe that's why they have warg blood now. That wasn't that. It's harder to argue that was some sort of engineering thing where they were like specifically trying to acquire that because of they probably did it because it was power, not because of they had some goal for their descendants, which is possible for or at least spelled out for Aegon. So yeah, the Bran is more like the thing with Bloodraven and looking for who the next Greenseer is, like who is born amongst this population that has the right traits. So George did both things, where some people are born with the traits and emerge, whereas other ones are engineered-ish. And that goes to what we were saying before about how he likes to pack in multiple variations on these core fantasy sci-fi ideas.
Yeah, yeah, magic power comes to them through different angles. Bran's more of a homegrown, natural Greenseer, whereas Jon is a deliberate result of Rhaegar trying to unite ice and fire. It seems I tend to think that Rhaegar probably got a vision from Bloodraven, saying, "Hey, Rhaegar, like you should marry a Stark to unite ice and fire and fulfill the prophecy." Because that's what's so funny about all the prophecy stuff. Like Aemon talks about, how he and Rhaegar were interested in prophecy, and Jaehaerys and I think Aerys the First probably as well. But we never get direct acknowledgement that Bloodraven himself was interested in prophecy. I think it must be true because it makes all of his actions make sense. But it's so funny that, there's no mention of like Bloodraven trying to communicate with Aemon, despite Bloodraven's interest in prophecy and Aemon's interest in prophecy. It's like, I don't know, it's so puzzling, and it makes me wonder if like the old gods and the Weirwood connection to Bloodraven might alter his behavior or might alienate him from the other Targaryens. Bloodraven is such an interesting character. But obviously, I think we've mentioned, the obvious similarities between Paul and Jon, both as these, lost scions, and both of them have a bloodline revelation. So, spoiler for Dune Book 1, but Paul finds out that his mother Jessica is the daughter of the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. So Paul finds out that he is partly a Harkonnen as well as an Atreides, and that's similar to how Jon will eventually find out that he is the son of a Targaryen as well as a Stark. So, both Paul and Jon, they have both the ice and the fire. The two opposite families are united in one, in the hero. So that's interesting. And they both...
Yeah, and Bloodraven himself is that thing, too. He was a united sort of a old god's family and a Targaryen father. So it's kind of passing down that legacy or continuing that legacy in a sense. And that also speaks to before what we said about the possibility that there's going to be secrets revealed about maybe history of the Starks. There may be some boogeyman hiding in their ancestry as well that maybe fits this theme as well.
Yeah, for sure. But Bloodraven almost makes me think of Hasimir Fenring, as in like Bloodraven is someone who's super powerful and who you almost might think could have fulfilled the prophecy himself in some sense, but no, he's super powerful, but he's relegated to the sidelines. And that's sort of similar to Hasimir Fenring, who was like almost a Kwisatz Haderach, but not quite. And he's powerful, but he doesn't quite get to take the stage himself, and he allows others to exist on that central stage instead of him, which is, I don't know, maybe there's something there.
That's kind of that makes me think a little bit to jump into a fantasy series that we haven't mentioned yet is Wheel of Time, where spend a long time. The show does it much quicker, but in the books it takes a long time for them to reveal who the true chosen one is, the Dragon Reborn. There's all these different candidates. It could be this person, it could be, and then they reveal that that's been going on for decades. That people every once in a while there's like, oh, this could be the Dragon Reborn. It's like, oh, nope, that wasn't them. And all these, it's kind of like it's a riffing on the concept of a Messiah or the false Messiah or the false prophet. But George and Frank Herbert, they just have a much different twist on how to do this. And especially George, because he's just writing a larger scale story, uses a lot of different variations of it, where it's the centerpiece of later in Dune, I suppose you could say, or early and later, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument in Song of Ice and Fire and in Dune that, that there won't necessarily be a true hero of the prophecy who is the person who saves the world. It's more just, the idea of a hero is a powerful idea that exists in every culture, and eventually someone will come along and be a central person in saving the world, and perhaps we will say that person was the hero, but that's not necessarily how the prophecies work. It's more of just an idea, and someone will happen to fit it, for better or for worse. Dune never really gives us a completely conclusive answer on who the Kwisatz Haderach is. Because, spoilers for Dune, but, you can argue that Paul didn't quite fulfill his destiny, and maybe later the second is more the real person who changes the world and knows everything and is super powerful, like the Kwisatz Haderach. But then, Duncan Idaho has arguably more of a claim to being the Kwisatz Haderach when, spoiler, Duncan gets resurrected hundreds of times. So Frank sort of loses interest with the idea of there being one absolute mega hero. Frank was interested in constant change, and it's more the idea of the hero that is significant than any one person fulfilling that role. And I can see that happening with A Song of Ice and Fire too, because there are already prophecies in A Song of Ice and Fire that are fulfilled multiple times in different ways. Like the whole, waking a stone dragon can fit Daenerys hatching her eggs from petrified stone eggs. But I think that also will connect to Jon Snow. I think Jon Snow will be resurrected, possibly in the stone Winterfell crypts, and will be a dragon in the sense that he's a Targaryen who embraces his Targaryen identity. So, already the prophecies, they can mean multiple things simultaneously. So that's why I don't think we'll have one Azor Ahai saving the world. I think that many people will be involved. Which, to its credit, the Game of Thrones TV show, that sort of is where they landed on the prophecy. Melisandre at one point says that, I think that, Jon Snow and Azor and Daenerys are both the prince that was promised. They both have a role to play in this story, which I think was kind of a cop-out, but I think that it also does capture something that may be true in the books, which is that there are multiple heroes, not just one person who fits the prophecy.
I agree with that, yeah. And then they go and have Arya deal the killing blow to throw another name in there, and I could even see, I don't think there's a boss other, but I could see something even like that happening with Arya wielding Dark Sister instead of the cat's paw dagger. It'd be a similar kind of thing. But yeah, this whole united goal of these things being brought to them through memories and through dreams or through prophecies is definitely a uniting factor that fits what you're saying, because it's applying to multiple characters. You have Bran coming through it by being discovered, like he was born with the right traits and they've chosen him because of that, and maybe they've looked for other people and discarded other candidates prior to that. And in the case of Dany, we discussed, and Jon, how their circumstances and dreams have guided them, and mentors, and there's connections and parallels between these mentors. And then then the same thing with Paul, except that for him it's more of all these things kind of combined, whereas maybe you could say that A Song of Ice and Fire versions are like reflections of a crystal and adding up to that one.
Like a Septon's crystal with many facets.
Yes, indeed.
So you mentioned,
I like some of the go ahead.
So you mentioned Arya killing the Night King in Game of Thrones Season 8. At the end of Dune Book 1, Aaliyah kills Vladimir with a little knife, just how Arya kills the Night King with a knife. So both of them have a girl using a little weapon to kill the bad guy in the end.
Doesn't she kill him with a needle? Isn't it a needle with the...
In Dune, it's the Gom Jabbar needle. And yeah, of
Right,
course,
which Arya wields needle. I love that.
which is fantastic. um,
That's cool. Alia and Arya are even similar sounding, like name-wise, you know.
and they both are the Dark Sister. They are the sister that sort of
Yes.
goes off on the strange path and strange mystical influences and comes back changed and comes back touched and comes back as a sort of scary individual who no one's quite sure what to deal with. And they are unique and they are isolated and they are subject to dark forces. And it's like, who is this person now?
Yeah, that sounds like both of them.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, and Aaliyah even has memories that aren't hers, and which Arya gets a bit of that when she puts on the little girl's face. She has memories of that girl, of that ugly girl, and presumably that's not going to be the only time this happens. So even that has a bit of a parallel to other people's memories.
Yeah. They both have a variety of mystical powers that no one else in the story has, because Arya is both a faithless man and a skin changer. Arya skin changes a cat and sees through a cat's eyes. So there's all these in the books, and so there's all these unique powers that they have that make them very strange. And they of course are the sister of a heroic protagonist in both stories. So big similarities there.
Don't the face dancers of Dune also acquire memories of people when they duplicate them or copy them, like the faceless men? Isn't that also kind of a carryover?
It's complicated. The face dancers evolve so that they like gain the ability. They gain new abilities that they didn't have before, which I think allows them to retain memories in ways that they couldn't before. Shape copiers who not only copied the surface memories of their victims, but the deepest thoughts and identity as well, as a form of immortality. And the Tleilaxu use face dancers to make themselves immortal, copying themselves through face dancery, but then the face dancers become too powerful, and then they go rogue, and they are against the Tleilaxu, and then they have cat people called futars who serve them and come from outside the universe. I'm not even going to get into what happens in Heretics in Chapter House. Yeah, the face dancers are like kind of maybe the ultimate bad in the final book of Dune, because there's the many-faced one who the honored matres are fleeing, and it's a whole thing. I mean there's sort of like these...
Many-faced one, really?
Oh yeah, it's kind of like the great other in Dune.
The many-faced god, yeah, jeez.
And then Daniel and Marty at the very end of Chapter House are the author self-insert characters, and they also simultaneously are evolved face dancers. So look, yeah, we're not even gonna get into that, but there certainly are like strong parallels between the face dancers and the faceless men. Suffice to say. Someone in the live chat, Brian Shattuck, just said that God Emperor has a Brienne.
Kidding.
What Brian means is that in Book 4, God Emperor of Dune, there's a character called Siona, who is I believe a blonde woman who is very tall and physically strong and physically tough, and is like not super smart, but is super loyal and is like well-intentioned. And it's interesting that Siona, well, that's a huge parallel. So, spoilers for Book 4. Siona ends up playing a role in killing her master, Leto II, the God Emperor. Siona ends up helping in the downfall of the person to whom she is devoted. And I think that is similar to the idea that Brienne might kill Lady Stoneheart. Brienne is sworn to serve Catelyn, and she's motivated by her loyalty to Catelyn, but a lot of people speculate that Brienne might kill Stoneheart, and I think that is quite likely. So, very similar to Siona helping kill Leto. Oh, not Siona. Yeah, you're right. Sorry, it's not Siona. It is... What's the bloody name? It's not Siona. It is... Someone in the live chat tell me what her name is. She's the big, tough, blonde woman. The fish speaker. What on earth is her name? Why have I forgotten? Well, it doesn't matter. Someone will tell me in the chat.
Yes, they will.
Naylor. Was it Naylor? Might have been Naylor. All right, let's continue. What should we discuss next? Should we discuss King Bran?
Sure, let's do that.
So
Yeah,
in
King Bran, good one.
yeah, so at the end of Game of Thrones season 8, Bran, the omniscient tree boy god, becomes king. And it's a bit weird. No one quite understands who Bran is, or what he knows, or what his purpose is, and what his destiny is, and how it all happened. And similarly, in Book 4, the Emperor of the Universe is later the second Atreides, who is a giant worm god who lives for 4,000 years and who does all these sort of messed up tyrannical things for the greater good, supposedly. Which has similarities to Bloodraven, who does these messed up things, supposedly for the greater good. So I've got to wonder, will King Bran really be a good thing for Westeros, or will King Bran be an immortal, omniscient tyrant who rules for thousands of years and messes with everybody? What do you reckon, Aziz?
Well, I don't know that we'll find out. I think George will leave us ambiguous clues if it does end in something like that. I think that given all the lessons of power, he's going to have trade in a huge variety of ways throughout the story. I don't think we're going to look on it as a great thing. I think we might look on it as something that would be good for a while, but will not be good in the long run, like all these other power structures, all these other things that wield so much power, especially putting it in one individual. And yeah, I don't think we'll be left with a feeling that it's going to go well in the long term, even if it'll probably work out in the short term, because the short term will have been so bad prior to the settling of events at the end. And yeah, other than that, it's pretty hard to see, though, because what kind of a king is he going to be? What kind of shape is the realm going to be? Who else is going to be around? Is it going to be a new form of government? Are we going to get that far? Like, I wonder. It seems on one hand, it seems like there is a lot of time for that, because, you know, how long will it take for the others to be defeated, and how much of the aftermath are we going to see? George is a big fan of the scouring of the Shire and the way The Hobbit ended with a lot of extra stuff at the end, and I kind of feel like he's going to do the same thing and not just end it suddenly. I think he's going to go into a good bit of what happens after a lot of the major events are resolved, but not for years worth. So it has to be, the future is going to have to be shown to us in terms of what we expect, and we're not going to actually see it.
Part of me would kind of love it if there was like an epilogue to A Song of Ice and Fire, which is Jon Snow returning from exile in the north to come south and to kill his brother King Bran, because King Bran has become obviously a puppet of the old god's weirwood hive mind consciousness, and Jon has to like tragically execute his own brother, his own beloved brother, because he needs to free Westeros from this magical alien tyrant. That would be a bit George Martinian, I think.
Werewood Emperor.
Yeah. Do you like the idea that Bran might become like a meat puppet for Bloodraven?
No, I don't think Bloodraven has those kind of ambitions. I mean, maybe like in terms of if he needs to use him to as a weapon. I don't think he would have designs on afterwards, because he never really tried to enrich himself or do things for himself. I don't think, in terms of the things we'd see someone would do if that's what their end game was. So yeah, I fall on the side of no on that one. I think his actions throughout his life mostly seem to be about protecting. He might know about which lines up with him knowing about the prophecy from a younger age.
I think part of what
if
makes,
not through Aegon, it's through his dreams.
Bloodraven has that line where he says, there was a brother I loved, there was a woman I desired. Like it does highlight that Bloodraven does have these personal desires, and I think we are invited to wonder if Bloodraven's fanatical opposition to the Blackfires was motivated not just by protecting the realm, not just by protecting the prophetic Targaryen bloodline, but also just by his personal beef with Bittersteel and their rivalry for Shiera Seastar. So I think it is like an open question. Like, is Bloodraven really acting in everyone's best interests, or does he have personal desires that he puts first? It's that love is the death of duty thing.
Yeah.
And I also love the idea that Bloodraven still has a relationship with Shiera Seastar if Shiera Seastar is Quaithe. I really like the idea of Shiera Seastar being Quaithe, even though it's a bit tinfoily. Maybe their love endures, for better or worse. So yeah.
I somewhat take that as him, expressing that's how he used to be, that's how he used to feel. But who knows? That doesn't really speak to what he feels now.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of like visual similarities between Bloodraven and Beric, because when we are introduced to Beric Dondarrion in the books, he's sitting on a weirwood throne. He has one eye. Does he have one eye?
And a black cloak, and he does. He has one eye. You're right.
He has a black eye. Cloak. He looks like a zombie. He's all like half rotting and dead. He's in a cave underground. So Beric is super similar to Bloodraven, and I think part of the similarity is that Beric has lost his humanity. And Bloodraven, I think, also has lost a lot of his humanity because the man's a tree. And, when Bran talks to Bloodraven, he's like, "Are you the crow?" And Bloodraven's like, "Oh, I guess I'm the crow. Long ago, I was kind of a crow." And, a lot has been made of that quote, arguing that Bloodraven is not really Bloodraven. But I think that, part of the point is that Bloodraven has lost his memories and his sense of, like, Bloodraven doesn't do anything that is very Targaryen-y. Like, Bran does not know him as Brynden Rivers or as a Targaryen bastard. Bran knows Bloodraven as the three-eyed crow. And I think that is what he is. He has lost so much of his Targaryen identity. He's lost so much of his soul and his emotion, and he really is largely just a goddamn tree. And
he's part of a collective, yeah.
So I suppose we can expect something similar with Bran, and that's sort of what happens with Leto II, the God Emperor. Like, he has the other memories of lifetimes and lifetimes of other people's experiences in his mind, and as a result, he is no longer Leto inside anymore.
They start to bleed together with him, don't they? Yeah.
So yeah,
similar thing, and we'd see that something like that maybe happening with Bran, or maybe that's sort of vaguely what has happened with Annie and her memories, with her ancestors sort of like calling to her or whatever.
We've got Joe Magician in the live chat. Welcome, Joe Magician.
Oh, hey, Joe Magician.
Joe Magician has many wonderful Song of Ice and Fire YouTube videos. Everyone should go check out and subscribe to Joe Magician, as well as going and liking and subscribing History of Westeros as well, link in the description. But Joe Magician in the chat says that the epilogue will be the scouring of Slaver's Bay, like the scouring of the Shire in Lord of the Rings, where good King Dario will bring peace to Essos.
Good King Dario. That is heavily foreshadowed.
Do you think Dario is secretly Euron, Aziz?
Oh, of course.
Of course.
Euron is about 17 different characters, including Cersei.
And Benjen, who is, of course, Arthur Dayne. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Should we talk some more about the... do you want to talk about, like, the Old Gods and the Bene Gesserit and the whole sort of memory thing?
Sure. It's a good little... We kind of touched on that a little bit here. Let's go deeper on that. So they've been... It seems like one of the main parallels is a sort of a chosen one-ish type figure, which Paul comes up in a couple different ways that way, whereas this facet of it in A Song of Ice and Fire falls on Bran, as opposed to maybe Jon or Dany or maybe Arya. And Bloodraven explains the rarity here, and maybe doesn't go so far as to call him a chosen one, but a person of unusual skill that's necessary for victory. But I'm not sure where you fall on that, whether it is more distinctly, you're the one, or just the one right now.
Yeah, I tend to think it's more of a one right now. Um, but I think it's so interesting how the Bene Gesserit and the Old Gods are both defined by memories. The Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers, they become Reverend Mothers by acquiring the genetic memories of all their female ancestors, and it's that knowledge that defines them, and it's that knowledge that empowers their schemes and their plans. And similarly, the Old Gods, it seems that when a person dies, their soul goes into the weirwood trees and goes into the Old Gods, and the Old Gods are a store of memories and knowledge. And the Children of the Forest are connected to that, and Bloodraven is connected to that, and that empowers their schemes. And it's powerful, but it's also dangerous because it's dehumanizing to be connected to all these other consciousnesses apart from your own. It's interesting that the Bene Gesserit are like they are feminine. They are like a typically like nurturing force symbolically, and the Old Gods are connected to trees and nature, like the Children of the Forest are nature elves basically. And yet, despite that sort of maternal, natural, nurturing vibe, there's a sinister nature to the Bene Gesserit and to the Weirwoods and the Old Gods. So it's this sort of horror of a consciousness that is greater and older than yourself. The horror of the hive mind, which can eat you.
The ancient wisdom that just is so much smarter than you are. It seems overwhelming. Like, how could you possibly defeat such a thing? Because it's been around so long and knows so much. It is part of the horror aspect, I think, some of the horror influence. And maybe if you branch out into maybe somewhere the real world influences are, is that these guys both lived through a lot of the Red Scare, where communism was seen kind of that way in a lot of ways of being a hive mind, of where everybody's the same, where you don't have individuality. And that's where some of the sinister elements come. Not that I'm pro-communism, but obviously Americans living in that era were just overwhelmed with anti-communism stuff. It was their main enemy, their main boogeyman. Then nuclear stuff came in a little later, but those things came together. But those are both in Dune, and grand destructive power exists in A Song of Ice and Fire. And George has written a lot of his other stories that involve like hive mind control type stuff. The Harangan hive minds of his Thousand Worlds setting are all about mind control and slave races, and some of those are engineered. And then on the smaller scale, his A Song for Leah, A Song for Leah, where it's like he wrote after a breakup, and the two characters, like one of them slowly, joins this like hive mind, and he loses her to that, and he's tempted to join it too, and so. These are things these authors both have lots of influences on, I think, and have written about elsewhere. So it's like this is the culmination of that. Having written about it and thought about it so much, they place it here in their masterpieces.
Yeah. Well, George, like all great writers, does his best writing after a breakup. But you noticed some similarities as well, I think, with the way that Paul is tested. Paul is given a deadly test by Gaius Mahayim to determine if he has the power and the inner strength sufficient to be the chosen one, which is so similar to how Bloodraven tests Bran with Bran's flying dream, which is he's told to fly or die. And he sees these ice spikes with the bones of other dreamers impaled upon them. And so the sort of wise but sort of sinister magical mentor subjects the hero to a deadly test, which they survive. But there's something messed up about how, Bloodraven and Gaius are willing to risk the lives of this child in order to find the powerful chosen one.
Yeah, it is pretty brutal. It gets into the themes of like why real world human sacrifice would happen. They would do it not for gain. Usually the reason it was done was to prevent some sort of have, mandate from was a revenge or outcome from heaven that was terrifying, like the gods would punish them or something. It was usually to stop something horrible from happening rather than, which is happening here, which is the exact same thing. Like, well, they're manipulating Bran or Paul or whoever to stop something worse from happening, according to them.
Yeah. Yeah, and ultimately meddling with these powers may cause more harm than good.
Yeah.
We talked a bit about
truth.
drugs in both Song of Ice and Fire and Dune. We mentioned like spice, and we mentioned weirwood paste. And yeah, there's also the water of life drug in Dune, which sort of sparks Paul's prescience and his psychic ability increasing, and that's really similar to Bran eating the weirwood paste to open his mind. And I think we're just down to some sort of miscellaneous points at this point. Is there anything else you want to jump to now?
One other thing about Bran, we maybe have mentioned this before, or maybe just either reiterate or reemphasize, or maybe I didn't say it, is that Annie and Paul both had their long, harrowing journey in the desert, which is a parallel. Also, of course, it's like a parallel to some real-world religious stuff. But that aside, Bran had a similar journey. It just wasn't in the desert. He had a harrowing Beyond the Wall, nearly died for several different things, nearly starved. Had to eat human flesh and didn't realize it. All these other things, which is a marker that they're on a similar journey of gotta suffer to become a hero, and then you're strong enough to face the even bigger challenge that affects everyone. And where it's going to end, I guess we don't know in this case yet, but it seems to be we have a pretty strong general idea.
Bran eats of the tree to acquire knowledge. It's all that biblical stuff is in there. Seasons and climate and ecology are themes in both stories, because in Dune they want to transform the deserts of Arrakis into a more hospitable climate, and in Westeros the seasons are irregular, which creates this challenge to survive. And the George Martin has said that at the end of A Song of Ice and Fire, the irregular seasons will be resolved, so perhaps they will, come into balance and regularity, similar to Arrakis becoming more hospitable.
That makes sense. That's cool. How about blue eyes being a big part of both stories? You get the others and the whites, versus the spice. Pretty different context, but still blue eyes. Big deal. Very important.
We mentioned the maesters, the sort of academic smart people who serve the lords but might sometimes plot against them, being similar to the mentats in Dune, who are the smart mathematical gigabrains who serve lords. Sook doctors as well.
One at a time, too, which is kind of, like
They're trained at a school and then they're distributed to the lords, and some people suspect plots and machinations. And Bene Gesserit also are, these smart, capable people who are distributed to lords, but some people suspect them of conspiracies and manipulations.
They're all one gender. Obviously, that Maesters are one gender and the Bene Gesserit are all one gender, right?
Yeah. I guess the closest thing A Song of Ice and Fire has to an all-female order is the Silent Sisters, who are intriguing.
Indeed.
And maybe we should...
What else do we have?
Talk about just some of the deeper, fundamental, like, sort of moral messages and thematic messages of the story. I feel that, Dune is very much about saying that, hey, like, superheroes are bad, messiahs and leaders are potentially catastrophic, like, we should not follow heroic leaders. Whereas I feel that A Song of Ice and Fire definitely questions and complicates the tropes of heroism, but I think that ultimately George does love the romantic tropes of heroes being heroic, and I think Brienne is a great example of that. George loves Brienne's heroism and her willingness to fight for what's right, and Jon's willingness to fight for what's right. I don't think the ending of A Song of Ice and Fire will be we were stupid for following Jon and we were stupid for following Daenerys and Brienne. I think that George does value their heroism in a way that Frank Herbert does not value heroism. I think that Frank Herbert values more cold, rational cunning and enlightenment and thinking on a higher plane in a way that George does not.
Yeah, I think that's that's pretty insightful way to put it. I think, and I think George sometimes gets accused of being too grim, but there's always these lights within this darkness that he paints. Like you said, Jon's a good example. Ned's a good example. You know, Brienne's a good example. These characters do good things. That they suffer consequences for being heroes. George is not unrealistic about the fates of people that do good. That doesn't. He also shows things and how those things carry forward even without those people's lives continuing, like Ned, and presumably some of these other characters will also die and will be their memories will matter to those that continue.
Yeah,
those that don't. And,
yeah. Call me an optimist, but I think that George Martin has a better hope of concluding and ending his series because I think George Martin is more conventional in his storytelling. Like George is very much into questioning and complicating tropes, but he ultimately, I think, is writing a story about heroism and goodness triumphing over corruption and despair. And that is not what Frank Herbert does with Dune. Frank Herbert in Dune is insatiably interested in rationally rethinking and reframing and recontextualizing situations and accepting no conclusion. Frank in Dune will accept no status quo, will accept no ending, because life for him is all about new beginnings and new discoveries and questioning everything constantly. So I think that's part of, you know, like both Dune and A Song of Ice and Fire are unfinished series currently. At least in my view, some people, well, no, they are both unfinished series. I tend to think that George might be able to stick some kind of a landing, whereas Frank Herbert, I think, with Chapter House, did not. But there's definitely similar.
Yeah, and then there's.
Go on.
Go ahead.
Well, there's also, I think, similarities in sort of the structure of the series, in how, you know, both series started out with like 3 books that were well received and fairly action-packed, and then the 4th book and the 5th book become a lot more meandering and a lot more indulgent and sort of philosophical, and introducing new characters and plot lines. I think that both Frank and George, they got a little bit too indulgent and undisciplined in introducing more and more stuff, and I think that's part of why they haven't finished their series. In that sense, they have a similar style of writing, I think.
Yeah, it could be they're maybe just more interested in the process or the journey than destination in a lot of ways, because they're writing entire worlds, and that conflicts with writing a story, not just worlds but universes. Especially given, in George's case, I know less about Frank, but in George's case, I know that he used to view the story as, you know, the history and whatever's in there is supposed to serve the story, but that was before his work became a franchise, and when those other world building details became valuable, whereas they would just be fun in most stories.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's changed for him. So the picture and the opportunity has changed for him. I'm not sure that was ever the case for Frank, because if you know, he got his show was, I mean, his books were adapted. They didn't achieve this level, not during his life. I mean, Dune is still being remade constantly, historically speaking, and doing well. But Frank's not there to see it. And whereas, you know, We're just having a bit of a different peak.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you make a good point that like both George and Frank, they had major popular adaptations, screen adaptations of their work while they were still writing the book series. And I think for both Frank and George, that gave them a huge commercial incentive to make a whole bunch more Dune and make a whole bunch more Game of Thrones. And I think that ironically, that may have prevented both of them from concluding their series. At a certain point, Frank Herbert in interviews said that I will not write more Dune books. He said that those first three Dune books, that was it. That was all there would be. And then because of the success of Dune and the popularity of the movie and stuff, that's why he wrote book 4 and then book 5 and book 6. So, and I think in a funny sort of similar way, it's the success of the Game of Thrones TV show that has largely distracted George from finishing the books and has perhaps even encouraged him to be overly perfectionist and to be overly indulgent with the later books that he's writing. So in a really ironic way, the mainstream success of these series may have prevented these series from having conclusions.
Yeah, isn't that funny? And it's also a bit of a parallel, like for different reasons, but George initially planned his story to be a trilogy. It wasn't because of the TV show that he expanded it. Obviously, that expansion happened earlier. But it's funny to think that Frank also was going to stop after 3 books and expanded it beyond, and just George, his plans changed before he got to that point, but it was still something they had in common about the way they conceived it initially.
Yeah. Carl Snark in the live chat says that as hard as George Martin's characters have it, they never give up. They want to live and win the day, no matter how flawed their personal philosophy. And he says that there are no nihilists in A Song of Ice and Fire. They all follow their passions. And yeah, I think that's a great way to say it, because the characters in Dune are not like that. Like the characters in Dune do wrestle with similar ideas of like love versus duty, with like Leto II's love for Hui Noré and all of that. But like the Dune books almost always land on the side of be a hard-ass Machiavellian rationalist. The only way to survive is to embrace the harsh rationalist perspective. Follow your brain, not your heart, is often, I think, the message of Dune. I think Frank Herbert sort of softened a little bit in his later books, and he certainly ends Chapter House with a more emotional human side. But I think overall, Dune is a lot more harsh and like rationalistic than A Song of Ice and Fire, which is ultimately very human and emotional and romantic and full of heart.
Yeah. Well said. I totally agree with that. I think it is special. I mean, even without having seen the ending yet, I think we can agree that there are more positive portrayals of relationships and positive outlooks, and the metaphor I used before was lights in the darkness and a different outlook. Like you say, more Herbert's maybe is more focused on surviving, like you said, whereas maybe George isn't as obsessed with surviving.
Yeah.
Whereas just a good life is more valuable than surviving. Like eking out a few extra years is like, what is that? Again, the Mary Mazdoor lesson. Like, what is a few extra years worth if those are bad years? Right? If you're suffering for those, did you really want those years? Right? So
yeah,
quantity versus quality is maybe part of backing up part of that debate there, and from a distant perspective, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, because like Frank Herbert in Dune is very interested in like survival of the human species as the absolute priority, and he has this very sort of like evolutionary biological perspective where he's like, it's about the survival of the species and our evolution in order to continue. George Martin is not so much into that. George Martin is more interested in like preservation of the human spirit, of like
yes,
healthy human emotions and goodness, and I think that George Martin, in a funny way, like the absolute survival of the human race is not his priority. I don't think George Martin in A Song of Ice and Fire fears the extinction of humanity quite in the same way that Frank Herbert does.
That's a great way to put it, yeah, or to frame it, yeah.
Yeah, which obviously, we're speculating about an unfinished series. I think we will learn a lot more of this when humanity faces an apocalyptic threat from the White Walkers in the later books. But Yeah, I think Frank and George have very different priorities in that sense as well.
Like two examples that George uses to really drive this point home. One of them is very straightforward because it's almost like a moral riddle playing out right in front of you. And it's pretty clear who he thinks the person that's right is. And that's Davos arguing with Stannis over sacrificing Cedric Storm.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
there's very little doubt in the reader's mind of who's right there. And even though Stannis is like, yeah, but the whole world could depend on it. It's like, yeah, but Davos is like, yeah, but it's wrong. This is a child. Like, it's definitely where it's like, yeah, what's the world? What about what's one child worth over the case? Like, he's like, everything. And you're like, yeah, Davos is right. Everything.
Yeah.
And then another one is like when Tywin's like, well, what's worse, killing 10,000 men at battle or a few men at dinner? And Tyrion's like, doesn't know what to say to that, but you're left thinking, yeah, but you're wrong about that. That's not to mention it's not really what happened about with the Red Wedding. Thousands of people were slaughtered at dinner, but let's say Tywin was being honest there, you'd still be like morally uncomfortable with that. It's like, I don't know if that's true though, like just. So the bad guys are, I mean, not that Tywin and Stannis are anywhere near the same type of character, but Stannis was clearly flirting with the moral fork in the road that is at least from George's point of view, I think is clearly defined. You may disagree. You out there might disagree with Stannis and Davos there. You might disagree with Tywin. You might agree with Tywin. But I don't think there's much doubt of who George agrees with. And I think George definitely agrees with Davos, and George definitely doesn't agree with Tywin. Because like you said, and I think you put it really well, it's about preserving the soul of humanity rather than the quantity or totality of humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is such a good point about Stannis and Edric Storm. I think that moment is the heart of A Song of Ice and Fire in a lot of ways. Like, it's that idea of, will you sacrifice a literal innocent human child for the sake of winning? And even for the sake of saving the realm. And yeah, as you say, the answer is no, you should not. Like, we should not sacrifice our soul for anything. It would be better for us to go extinct than for us to sacrifice our souls and our compassion. Whereas in Dune, the message of Dune is you should absolutely sacrifice your human compassion for the sake of survival, because that's what the God Emperor Leto does in Book 4. He oppresses humanity cruelly for 3,000 years for the sake of our survival. And, even Paul's jihad, in which he kills billions of people and sterilizes entire planets. I mean, it's sort of framed as a bad thing, but kind of not as well. Like it was just like a necessary part of his ascension. And in the conversation Paul has with Leto in Book 3, Leto says that, yeah, you committed a genocide and killed trillions of people, and you didn't go far enough, is what Leto says in Book 3. Leto tells Paul, you were too much of a pussy to do what was necessary in completely subjugating the world. So it's like genocide was not enough. And so it's like, oh my God, Frank Herbert. Like, George would rather sacrifice humanity than kill one bastard boy, but Frank is entirely willing to subjugate a universe for the sake of our survival. So yeah, that may be the key, the heart of the difference between George Martin and Frank Herbert.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I think I hadn't thought about this nearly as much. I like how much we've gotten into it just kind of naturally during this discussion.
Yeah, Lucas Hunt in the live chat says, who is Tywin Lannister's parallel in Dune? I would say the closest parallel to Tywin Lannister is goddamn Leto II, the God Emperor of Dune. Like, Dune Book 4 is like, what if Tywin was the Emperor of the universe? Like, that is what Book 4 is like, because Leto is the ultimate Machiavellian, I will sacrifice everything for like the survival. And I mean, Tywin is more self-interested. Tywin is more proud and self-interested, and he's got daddy issues. But in terms of like sacrificing anything to win, and in terms of like making those, what is killing 100 men at dinner compared to killing 1,000 on the battlefield, like that is something that Leto, God Emperor, would say. So
yeah, like Tywin absolutely sacrificed the souls of all his children, like in that sense. Like he made them all, they all turned out serious issues because of his goals, right? Like these are like, you can draw a line from one to the other, and his pride. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that we should wrap this up shortly. This was a
Okay.
wonderful chat. I think we've covered a lot
Indeed.
of interesting ground. Before
Here's
we,
here yeah, I had like three quickies, quick fun ones we could
oh
throw
yeah,
out if we
absolutely.
wanted to wrap up with some miscellaneous, if that's cool.
Yeah,
Have time for that.
we'll spend some time answering the last of the super chats. So if anyone's got anything they
Cool.
desperately want us to chat about, let us know. But yeah, well, let's finish up with some fun miscellaneous things.
So one I think is Duncan, Idaho, and Duncan the Tall. I mean, Duncan is not a super rare name, but it's a kind of an odd name to be in A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, both series are noted for not really going to, at first at least, with using a lot of familiar names. In George's case, he uses ones that are just slightly different, like Joffrey instead of Jeffrey, or
Yeah,
Edard instead of Edward. Like there's
Rickard
so
instead
many
of Richard.
examples like that in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah,
Whereas Dune uses all these biblical names, and also a lot of like Middle Eastern names that aren't as familiar to a lot of Western readers, but still are like Earth names.
yeah.
For Duncan and Duncan, they have a lot in common besides their name too.
Yeah, I think I saw some funny tweet that was about how, like, June is like, there's a character called Tayeka Nick and Shaddam and all these wild names, and there's a guy called like Fred or George, like Paul. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of funny the different vibes they use for the languages.
We also
Uh,
have another one. There's a wildling named Halleck, and Heron the Black's father was also named Halleck. Halleck Hor. I don't know if that might be a nod to Gurney, but it
yeah,
might just be
Gurney Halleck.
Halleck.
I don't know. I don't know. Is Halleck a common name? I don't know any Hallecks.
I Googled Halleck like 15 minutes ago in advance of this little note, and there's a couple, and it comes up a couple times, but it's not, yeah, it doesn't seem very common or famous for much. So I feel like it's probably connected, at least, maybe a nod.
Yeah, cool.
um,
It's interesting.
one,
It's interesting how dragons seem to be involved in the creation of Valyrian steel in A Song of Ice and Fire, which is like the crucial weapon. And in Dune, sandworms are the source of crysknives, which are the important weapons like Valyrian steel. And also sandworms make the
oh
spice,
yeah,
which is the all-important drug. So like the big powerful monster is the source of like tools and weapons and power as well.
that's true. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the Chris knife and Valyrian steel combo. I had noticed the pale white glow and noticed that would be a parallel to Dawn, and the worthiness to wield it, which is a parallel to Dawn. But that's not really an direct influence. That's more of a recurring trope in mythology of the worthiness to wield, like Excalibur or Mjolnir or any number of famous weapons that you have to be of certain character or whatever to wield.
Yeah, yeah. Frank Herbert talked about the sandworm as like the archetypal monster that the hero must face, the beast, the dragon guarding the gold. So it's appropriate that like the archetypal beast monster that the hero must face is the source of the sword, the special magic sword, the blade that the hero wields. And George certainly plays with that with his dragons and Valyrian steel as well.
Oh, right on. Here's one from our friend Nina. Shout out to goodqueenally.tumblr.com. She pointed out that Irulan sneaks Chani contraceptives. But Chani takes fertility treatments and kind of counteracts that, I guess. And in Game of Thrones, Sybil Westerling gives her own daughter contraceptives and tells her they're fertility drugs.
Yeah.
So to prevent her from conceiving with Robb. And Jane even talks about how she's expecting to have twins. She's like excited she's gonna have twins.
Oh.
So she obviously doesn't, but deepens the potential parallel there.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. And also, Jane and Rob's relationship is sort of a forbidden and ill-advised one, in the same way that Jessica objects to Chani and Paul's relationship because it's not the best political
Ooh.
move. in her
And that's
opinion.
exactly, yeah. Catelyn objects to the, yes, very good, because we've already made a ton of Catelyn Jessica parallels, so that fits in there that category very nicely.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Rob. Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely, absolutely check out Good Queen Alisane on Tumblr. Nina Friel does some
Yeah, yeah.
really excellent Song of Ice and Fire analysis.
Very insightful stuff. Yeah, it's a lot of real world parallels too. She's good with that.
Yeah.
Okay, my last one. My last one. This is pure fun. There was a very recent episode of Futurama from the reboot of Futurama, um, which had a micro adventure inside a cat litter box or a litter box. I guess it was. I don't know if it was cat litter. I forget. Anyway, they were. It was Doong, like Dune, but Doong, and there was worms in there, and they were like the sandworms. And Futurama, of course, is made by the same creators as The Simpsons, and The Simpsons did a Game of Thrones episode. So Futurama did a Dune episode. Simpsons did a Game of Thrones episode. There you go.
We
Finally.
need a Dune explained video stat, don't we?
Yes, Doong, Doong, right?
I think there was around the time that the Dune book came out in the 60s, there was like a parody book that came out that was called Dune, Doon, and it was like some just some parody of Dune that came out. You always forget that, like, the 60s is when Dune came out. Such a different time in terms of media.
Yeah.
The idea of like parody books coming out is not something that happens a lot in 2023, is it?
No.
I don't know a lot of parodies of popular movies coming out in book form, but I guess that's what we did before YouTube and TikTok.
Okay, so what year did the first book Dune come out? Because
65, I think.
I'm pretty sure George R. R. Martin was born. He was a teenager when JFK. I'd say he was born in 48. Yeah, so he would have been 17 when Dune came out. So that's like, yeah, right in his developing nerd brain wheelhouse, right there.
Ooh, yeah.
Pretty perfect. Yep. Slides right in there with those Marvel comics we mentioned earlier. Stan Lee was doing his thing, and Frank Herbert was emerging on the scene with a game changer.
It would have been so fascinating to hear them have a conversation.
Yeah, it really would have been. That's true. I wonder if they, wonder if that ever happened. I wonder if they're. I'm sure their paths must have crossed a few times, but it doesn't mean they had like discussions or, you know, let alone anything more substantial than that. Be something worth researching.
For sure. All right, well, let's respond to the last of the super chats, and then I think we will wrap up this live stream. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Cool.
Please like and subscribe, and we will have a look at. Thank you for the super chat from Professor 13N, who says, "Love the content. Have you seen the Game of Thrones RPG? It came out before A Feast for Crows and is super interesting. Shout out to Stannis, the one true king, and Thaddeus Rowan. Have you played the Game of Thrones RPG, Aziz?"
Never played it, but I looked at the rule books. There used to be some lore from it that was cited. It's maybe more considered semi-canon now, but there were some things about like at least the Monstrous and a few other characters that popped up in there that were small little tidbits that were fun. So, in our effort to try to learn every little bit of lore, we had to look at those things. But I never actually played it, which is too bad because it seems like it would have been fun.
Yeah, Professor might also be referring to the video game RPG that came out,
Oh.
which I also haven't played, but some people say that it's good. It looks a little bit I don't know. It doesn't look like the easiest game to get into, but apparently it's good.
Yeah, there were a couple of them. There was like a Game of Thrones Conquest, which didn't do very well, and there was the one where you could play the Night's Watch character and the R'hllor priest, which I did play a little bit of. And then there's the CK3 and CK2, Crusader Kings 2 and 3, Song of Ice and Fire mods that I stream on Fridays, which are like full. You're playing the whole dynasty through, like playing out the character until they take over as their heir. Then there's Mountain Blade did a mod as well, so you could play sieges and small parties, skirmishing and fighting. Normally it's set in a regular like medieval setting, but there was a mod for Westeros, and it was quite good. Yeah, quite good. I don't know if it's been updated or if there's a new one or whatever, but there are a lot of good Game of Thrones RPGs out there, and I imagine there's more coming one of these days.
It is wild to me though that the literal most popular TV show of our era, the best video game adaptations that it has are mods made by fans. The people who own this IP have not managed to turn the most popular fantasy story of our time into a decent, into a popular, good video game, which is
good point.
A bit ridiculous. Thanks for
kind
the
of a fumble, isn't it?
Thanks for the super chat from Sir Flement Brax, who says, I'm starting a fund for a new Durkheim video from Shift. Yeah, one of the really, really early Alt Shift X videos was about a sociology theory from Emil Durkheim. That's a very old video, so I have no memory of whether that video is any good or not, but I'm glad that people have enjoyed it, and we have made more non-fiction videos like the religion and disaster video, and I would like to make more non-fiction videos in future. So look out for them.
That's cool. Yeah, right on.
Thanks for the super chat.
I encourage you that as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to you, Cass, who says, I'm here for Wallace and Wooble and a sprinkle of winkles on my dinkle. Thank you for that, Cass.
Excuse me?
And thank you, Among Us Law, who said, last year you said The Winds of Winter will come out next year or never. Are we doomed? Aziz, are we doomed?
I don't think we're doomed. You know, it's a funny silver lining of the U.S. writers and actors strike is that all of George's Hollywood projects are paused. So he really can't do anything else but work on the book. And from what we've heard, we know a couple of his people. He's written quite a lot. He's written, it's going to be the biggest book of the series probably. And so it's not as if he's stuck. He might be stuck in certain places, but he's not stuck overall. He's been writing. And so, yeah, I remain optimistic about at least something, but I'm not going to put any sort of timeline on it. I've played that game before and lost.
Yeah.
As we all have.
Yeah, like everyone, I was a fool for trying to predict a year. He does say that he's 2/3, 75% finished with the book is what he said most recently, right?
I think so. I don't recall. Yeah, there's been so many updates over the years. They're all blur now.
Yeah. Well, I can't help but notice that it took him 12 years to get to 3/4 of the way, and he started at 1/4 of the way because a quarter of the book was cut from the previous book, Dance. So if it took him 12 years to write half the book, it could easily be 6 years to write the last quarter of the book, if my math is right. So, don't do the math is my advice.
George isn't great at math anyway, so, maybe it'll just work out through his conception of math.
Yeah, that's right. We shouldn't do the math because George doesn't do the math. George's writing process does not follow any human mathematics, so we should not attempt to predict it. And thanks Nuisance, who says, is there a chance we'll get everything we want for the A Song of Ice and Fire universe? Even if we get The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring, we're not going to get all the Duncan Egg novellas. What do you reckon, Aziz?
There's no way we get everything we want because there's so much that we want. Yeah, so that's kind of in some ways that's a low-hanging fruit answer because I want more than is reasonable in the first place.
Yeah, so, there is no end to what we want. If George did by some miracle deliver Winds and Dream and 12 Duncan Egg books and part 2 of the George R. Marillion Fire and Blood part 2, we would just ask for 1,000 more. And I think George knows he's in a bit of a Sisyphean never-ending trap, which is, it's enormous success, but it's also something that he will literally never escape until the day that he dies. So there's good and bad here. There's bittersweet.
Yeah, right. I have a question for Nuisance, a return question back at them. And what do you know about de-aging and modern medical procedures?
Maybe we need a GoFundMe to invest in some cryogenic science for George Martin. But he doesn't like it when people speculate about his death. So maybe we shouldn't.
I wouldn't either. I wouldn't want that either. That doesn't or yeah.
And
I
yeah,
wouldn't want to hear that.
Professor 13 clarifies that he was talking about the tabletop D&D-esque RPG. Aziz, the
Oh, cool.
deluxe rule book says it's an 8 out of 10.
Nice.
I think it's time to wrap up this stream. It's been a long stream.
Yes.
Aziz,
fun.
thank you so much for joining in, talking about
Thank you.
Song of Ice and Fire and Dune.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great. We had a lot of notes, but we also had a lot of things come up, which is the essence of a good discussion when you're prepared, but also discussion takes you places you didn't expect. You're inspired with new ideas, and yeah, this was great. This was a lot of fun. This is, like I said at the beginning, a niche discussion, but that's also that kind of the essence of geek culture is finding your niches and being passionate about them, regardless of who else is watching or caring. And I think a lot of y'all did care. A lot of y'all enjoyed this, especially this person who asks if this picture of Duke, Leto, and Ned Stark, meaning Sean Bean and Oscar Isaac, is pictures of you and me.
Yeah, that's exactly how I look. That's correct.
Yes, we look like amalgams of them both. Yes,
that's right. Yeah, no, thank you so much for coming on. And you know, Aziz did most of the work writing up some notes, checking out these similarities. So I'm grateful for that. And do check out Aziz's channel, History of Westeros, one of the great long-running OG Song of Ice and Fire community institutions is History of Westeros. Though History of Westeros was one of my inspirations in covering Song of Ice and Fire myself on Alt-Shift-X. So definitely support him.
You're very kind. Thank you for that. Yeah, History of Westeros is our channel name. We're on all the podcast platforms too. We're a bit more of our stuff. We do both on YouTube and podcast platforms, but we're a little bigger over there. We're trying to do more videos because even our podcast host, Spotify, these days is pushing video. So yeah, but this was super fun. I love having discussions with other smart people that know their stuff with these great large fandoms, and we got really meta today. This is one of the most meta discussions I've ever had. We were talking about like things that influenced them as kids and what drugs they did, and, like all this other stuff. That's really getting into it, man.
Yeah, no, always love getting into the heart of it all. So yeah, thanks so much, Aziz. We'll wrap it up. Everyone slap like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.